He was one of the most feared rulers in history. Ivan the Terrible, the first Tsar of all the Russias.
He was a torturer, a murderer, a rapist.
Definitely a psychopath.
But legend says the ruthless tyrant had a secret. A library of priceless books hidden in the labyrinth beneath the Kremlin.
Ivan the Terrible's library is really one of the great underground myths.
The mythical library contained the greatest lost works of ancient literature. In the 20th century, one man set out to prove it really existed.
If it was discovered, it would transform our knowledge of the past.
It was a journey into the darkest terrors of the Soviet Union.
Stelletskii was really a man bordering on obsession.
He also had to be brave, of course.
His terrifying enemy, the forces of Stalin's secret police.
Stelletskii was crazy. You don't go looking for secrets in the Soviet Union.
It was a deadly treasure hunt, where the ultimate prize was knowledge.
We are talking about a man who is seriously prepared to risk his life.
This is the story of the quest for Ivan the Terrible's library. The legend of Ivan the Terrible's library began far from Russia, in 15th century Constantinople. The capital of the Byzantine Empire was the dazzling center of European culture.
It is the power engine that drives Christian Europe. This is a world where there is a real premium on scholarship and on learning.
One of the city's greatest treasures was said to be its magnificent library, home to priceless masterpieces of ancient Greek and Roman literature. Legend says the books were bound in gold.
In those days, of course, books were extremely valuable.
Books typically would be encrusted by jewels or would have beautiful decorations on them that were objects of enormous beauty as well as of scholarship.
But in 1453, the empire fell to Muslim invaders.
It's a heartbreaking moment. Churches being converted into mosques, books disappearing, jewels being sacked, men and women being pressed into slavery. The whole story is a very difficult and painful one.
To escape the dying city, the emperor's niece, Sophia, was married to a Russian prince. The legend says that 800 precious books went with her to Moscow.
The books that Sophia brought over, if they were discovered now, would probably triple the volume of Greco-Roman literature available to us.
But it was Sophia's grandson who created the legend of the library. In 1547, Ivan the Terrible became the Tsar of Russia. He was a tyrant and sadist who reveled in bizarre forms of torture.
He only ever laughed when observing tortures. He would have people skinned alive, for example. They would be put into boiling water and then into ice water, and then their skin would be just pulled off.
But despite his cruelty, Ivan was a man of learning and sophistication.
Knowledge-hungry person, ahead of his times, you know. Multilinguist, polymath.
Poet, a musician, a theologian, a philosopher, and he established the first printing press in Russia.
According to legend, the scholarly Ivan took extreme measures to guard his precious library. He hid it away, deep beneath the Kremlin. In a man-made labyrinth of tunnels, formed by sealing off Moscow's underground rivers. The secret location of the library changer was known only to a trusted few. But Ivan's reign descended into paranoia. No one was safe, not even his own family.
The legend says that Ivan killed anyone who knew of the secret location of the library. He even murdered his son.
Finally, Ivan himself died during a game of chess. He took his greatest secret to the grave.
And that looked like the end of the line. Everybody who knew about the library and the places where it could have been hidden was now dead.
By the 20th century, there was no evidence that the library had ever existed. Most Russian academics thought it was a legend and nothing more. But in 1912, an ambitious archaeologist set out to prove them wrong.
He didn't think it was just any old mystery. He believed with every fiber of his body that the library actually existed and that he was going to find it.
Ignatius Stelletskii was raised in the Ukraine, but he learned his trade in the ancient city of Jerusalem. While exploring its warren of underground caves and tunnels, he'd first heard tell of the legend of Ivan's library. It brought him to Moscow and put his subterranean skills to the ultimate test.
Stelletskii solved mysteries by digging.
Stelletskii used to tap his way along the walls, trying to listen for change in the sound, in the resonance of the rock that may have indicated a cavity or space behind that he could dig into.
Stelletskii thought the academics of the Russian establishment were afraid to get their hands dirty. Finding Ivan the Terrible's library was a job for a seasoned underground expert.
It must have been like a red flag to a bull, really. When the establishment tell you that it doesn't exist, that must be incredibly exciting for an ambitious, pushy young scholar.
It was his obsession throughout his adult life to find that library.
Stelletskii planned to dig beneath the walls of the Kremlin. But his first step was to target the likeliest location where Ivan might have hidden his library.
The research you do before going underground is the intellectual challenge. It's a puzzle. You're trying to put the pieces together. The final piece of the puzzle is the dig, is going underground itself.
Stelletski's starting point was a map of the Kremlin that charted the building in the 16th century. A sprawling citadel of towers, cathedrals, and military buildings.
Kremlin is a mini-city. Like so many fortified towns in the West, it was supposed basically to harbor the whole population of the town with all the infrastructure in place.
Finding the library was a daunting task. The Kremlin covered an area of more than 3 million square feet. But by piecing together snippets of information, Stelletskii created a second and far more specialized map. It was a rough outline of the Kremlin's vast and ancient network of underground tunnels. Ivan had used it to hide his library and to hide himself in times of trouble.
There were lots of tunnels built for security reasons, because those were not vegetarian times in Russian history, and there were frequent uprisings in which everybody would be cut to little pieces.
Stelletskii noticed that the tunnels seemed to converge beneath one of the Kremlin's most famous landmarks. He decided that this building, the Arsenal Tower, would be his #1 target in the quest for Ivan's library.
The Arsenal Tower was probably the most prominent one, and it was also the most likely place under which the treasure could be hidden.
Stelletskii looked deeper into the tower's history, and it soon became clear that he was on the right track.
Stelletskii discovered he wasn't the first man to dig under the Arsenal Tower in the Kremlin.
In the 18th century, the Russian nobleman Prince Mikhail Sherbatov had blazed a trail for Stelletskii to follow. Beneath the Arsenal Tower, he discovered a gateway to the secret labyrinth beyond. Exploring further, he found the tunnels were lined with distinctive white stone. Sherbatov never found Ivan's library, but his story gave Stelletskii vital clues.
Stelletskii definitely thought he could do better than Sherbatov because Sherbatov never did find the library and Stelletskii thought he would.
Stelletskii now knew he had to find Sherbatov's gate. If he could break through it, a labyrinth of white stone would mark the way to the library.
Stelletskii thought that every time he could see a white stone, he is on the right track.
Stelletskii was ready to search the Kremlin, but he'd be taking his life in his hands. In 1912, revolution was in the air. Ruthless oppression by the Tsar Nicholas II had earned him the nickname Bloody Nicholas. His fearsome secret police had the Kremlin under tight control.
Throughout the reign of Nicholas II, there was a very real danger of revolutionary outbursts. I mean, his own grandfather was blown in half by a bomb. So he had a secret police, and therefore anybody digging in the darkness of tunnels under Kremlin was bound to be seen as at least a potential subversive.
Stelletskii hit on a subterfuge. He offered to do an archaeological survey of the Arsenal Tower's basement. His team were kept under close supervision, with the deeper levels of the building strictly out of bounds. But Stelletskii waited for the guards and workers to take their lunch break, then slipped out of sight.
He realized only too well that by doing so he was risking his life. But for someone who is obsessed, this can actually be an attraction.
There was an iron stairwell leading deep below the tower. To Stelletskii's amazement, Sherbatov's gate was at the bottom. The ancient bars were rusted through. The hunt for the library chamber was on.
For Stelletskii, it was a challenge. Here he could test his skills.
Stelletskii had to work fast before his absence was noted. And exploring further, his attention was drawn to the floor. Scraping away layers of gravel and earth, he made a tantalizing discovery. There was a cavity which revealed the secret labyrinth below. But there was no time to find a way down.
He still had some common sense left. Doing so would mean an immediate arrest.
Stelletskii got back in the nick of time. To investigate the tunnels in safety, he knew he would need official permission.
The Kremlin, after all, is a fortress, and it always has been. You need to have the benediction of the ruling elite to be allowed anywhere near, and to go and look and see what's there.
But the academic establishment was blocking Stelletskii's way. Its most eminent figure was Professor Sergei Belyakurov.
Belyakurov was that sort of scientist, Russian scientist, let's say it, who were always very careful, not to raise their head above water, because in Russia, the moment you raise your head above water, it gets hit.
Belyakurov had written an official report dismissing the library as a myth. So there would be no digging in the Kremlin unless Stelletskii came up with hard evidence of the library's existence.
Labyrinth was a real authority on the subject. So as far as the Russian scientists were concerned, the matter was closed. I mean, there was no library, and that was it.
Stelletskii vowed to prove them all wrong.
Faith is important, and that is part of Stelletski's crusade, really. It's motivated by a deep belief that these books really did exist once upon a time, and that they can be found.
Stelletskii planned to reinvestigate a key story from Belokhurov's report. In the 16th century, an Estonian scholar named Johann Veterman had reputedly seen the library itself. Ivan the Terrible had invited him to translate its ancient masterpieces from the original Greek and Latin. But having learned the secret of the library, Veterman was now in fear for his life.
He was a clever man, and he was terrified.
Ivan the Terrible has a truly terrible reputation, and he's renowned for acts of extraordinary cruelty.
Veterman pretended to start his task, then made good his escape from Moscow. But not before making a list of all the books he could remember. Veterman's list had supposedly resurfaced in 19th century Estonia, but had now disappeared. Belokhurov thought the story was fiction. Stelletskii aimed to prove it was fact.
He didn't believe Belokhurov's conclusions.
Stelletskii headed 500 miles from Moscow to the last known location of Veterman's list. The town library in Perno, one of the oldest towns in Estonia. But after years of neglect, its storerooms were in disarray.
It was a mess. Everything was scattered around, and actually quite a lot of effort was needed to find what he was looking for.
You can imagine that this library was chock full of nuts, meaning scrolls, rolls, books, scraps of paper. Things were by no means easy to find there.
Stelletskii was drowning in a sea of dusty books and reams of paper. He didn't even know what Veterman's list would look like.
But because Stelletskii was convinced he was going to find the catalog, he kept digging and digging and digging and digging.
The breakthrough finally came when a tattered fragment of paper caught Stelletski's eye. It was a string of illustrious names, and the list was initialed with the Russian form of the letter V.
The letter V at the bottom, which could mean only one thing: Veterman. Eureka, he found it.
Stelletskii was dumbfounded. Veterman's list was a roll call of the greatest authors of antiquity.
Veterman's list is one of those sort of totally unbelievable lists. Every treasure that we don't have in Latin and Greek literature is on it.
The list contained 100 unknown volumes of Livy's histories of the Roman Empire. And there were lost works of ancient Greek drama.
The idea that we could find plays by Aristophanes that aren't known about or are known but are lost, I mean, it's unbelievable.
Finally, Veterman listed missing pages from the 12 biographies of Caesar by the historian Suetonius.
It looks like a list of what a historian would like to find if he was let into the great sweet shop of history.
If Stelletskii could find Ivan's library, he would literally change human history.
It would transform our knowledge of the past. I mean, I think you'd lick your chops if you had any hope of catching a few pages of one of these texts. The idea that you might find all of them together, it's astonishing.
But now Stelletskii made a fateful mistake. He left Vetterman's list behind and took his own copy back to Moscow, certain that no one could now stand in his way.
If you have a catalogue, it proves that Belokurov was wrong and Stelletskii was right.
But to Stelletski's disbelief, he still couldn't find a historian who would take him seriously. No one would risk their reputation on a scrap of paper. Stelletskii didn't even have the original list in his hands.
Stelletskii had been given the chance of a lifetime, and he bungled it.
Access to the Kremlin was denied. And there was no second chance. In 1914, Russia was hurled into World War I. Swept up in the tide of history, Stelletskii was banished from Moscow and sent to the front.
The war was a disaster for Russia and for the Tsar.
The Tsar was badly prepared for conflict. Entire Russian armies were annihilated. At home, the country exploded into violent revolution. For ordinary people, the only priority was survival.
When the Bolshevik Revolution swept through Russia, Russia was essentially destroyed. I mean, millions were dying or starving to death or emigrating. Great historical buildings were being razed to the ground.
In the turmoil, Stelletski's quest for Ivan the Terrible's library was totally irrelevant.
With that kind of cataclysm unfolding, a lowly little library was of little interest to anybody, and Stelletskii must have feared that that was it.
Who cares about the library, even it was the Tsar's library? Who cares about books? Books were only good for throwing into the oven to make yourself warm.
The victorious Bolsheviks murdered the Tsar and took power in Moscow. For ordinary citizens, the times were more dangerous than ever.
The Bolsheviks, they were ready to see counter-revolution everywhere.
For 7 years, Stelletskii kept his head down. His obsession with the Kremlin could only attract deadly suspicion.
He was still an archaeologist, but now he had to become a careful archaeologist. Anybody dealing with the Bolsheviks had to be good at playing the game, because the bad players get shot.
Stelletski's only chance of survival was to adapt to the new Soviet Union.
Stelletskii realizes that to be able to carry on with this project, he has to become what in modern terms we call politically correct.
In 1924, Stelletskii was ready to renew his quest by campaigning in the communist newspapers. He claimed that underground exploration would reveal the treasures of Russia and give them back to the people.
He wanted to sound like a good Marxist, taking treasures from the rich and giving them back to the poor.
Stelletskii proclaimed, "The time has come to turn underground Moscow inside out." His timing was perfect. The communists themselves were already digging up the city. The new Moscow metro would make Russia the envy of the world. It was the ultimate expression of Soviet power under its sinister new leader, Joseph Stalin.
There was now a new Tsar in the Kremlin named Joseph Stalin, and he wanted to immortalize his Tsardom by building the greatest engineering works known to man, which is the underground network under the city known as the Moscow Metro.
Stelletskii was made an official archaeologist on the metro excavations. His task? To assess any unexpected discoveries by the engineers. The tunnels were full of the flotsam and jetsam of Moscow's ancient history. Shards of pottery had somehow found their way down from the city's kitchens. But secretly, Stelletskii was hunting for bigger game. Ivan the Terrible's library.
Stelletskii thought he probably could latch on to the tail end of that project and do his own thing.
The metro was extending Moscow's ancient labyrinth with 50 miles of new tunnels. They even penetrated beneath the Kremlin itself. Whenever he had the chance, Stelletskii listened for hollow walls and the library chamber. But with Stalin's agents everywhere, he was playing a very dangerous game.
This was really very brave, dicing with death. He was now at the very heart of the system, swarming with secret policemen.
Stalin ruled the Soviet Union by terror. By the late 1920s, he was gathering all the reins of power in his own hands. His image and statues dominated the streets. All opposition was ruthlessly hunted down by his vast network of secret police.
Stalin is generally believed to be paranoid. He lived in constant fear of assassination.
Anyone working beneath the Kremlin would be under suspicion. And as Stelletskii homed in on the Arsenal Tower, his finds were turning sinister. The workers were terrified to discover skeletons beneath their shovels, unidentified victims of some ancient crime. For Stelletskii, it was a daily reminder of Moscow's violent past.
It was very dangerous to keep doing what he was doing, but nevertheless he kept listening, kept putting his ears to the walls and listening and listening and listening, risking his life every single moment.
By 1933, Stalin had assumed total control of the Communist Party. The rule of law was replaced by the word of a single man. Stalin now had the power of life and death over every citizen of the Soviet Union.
No one was immune from disappearing from the street or from one's flat in broad daylight or at night. No one, not even the people who shouted louder than everyone else, "Long live Comrade Stalin."
In this terrifying climate, Stelletski's chance to find the library finally arrived. Word came through of a serious accident underground, close to the Arsenal Tower. Stelletskii raced to the scene. The metro excavations had caused a massive collapse, all the way through to street level. But for Stelletskii, it was a godsend. Because the collapsing tunnel walls had also revealed a hidden passage. Stelletskii was certain they had broken through to Ivan's secret labyrinth. But when he finally got there, he was desperate to investigate. But the workers wouldn't let him come near. The collapse had brought Moscow to a standstill. Stalin's henchmen in the Kremlin couldn't move their cars.
That's a very serious, one would say potentially lethal problems for the engineers, because one thing they have to do, above all, is to keep the traffic flowing for the party bosses in the Kremlin.
The terrified engineers were racing to repair the damage.
They didn't care much about secret passageways. What they did care about was staying alive.
There was nothing Stelletskii could do. Stalin's men were in control.
Stelletskii was absolutely devastated. That was the chance he had been waiting for so long, and now it looked like he had lost it.
Stelletski's dream was in tatters. The breakthrough was sealed for good.
That must have been a shattering blow to Stelletskii. So near, yet so far.
Right then, Stelletskii decided to stake his life on one last desperate gamble. Somehow, he had to get Stalin's regime to back his quest for the library. And he realized that Ivan the Terrible himself could show him the way. Stelletskii planned to exploit a curious story about the Tsar. During Ivan's reign in the 16th century, he'd made frequent trips to the forests west of the Kremlin. His companions were trusted members of his personal bodyguard. But they would come back from the woods alone, with an unbelievable tale to tell.
Ivan wanted to cultivate an awesome, almost supernatural image.
According to the story, Ivan would simply vanish, as if by magic. He would later reappear in the Kremlin palaces, as if nothing had happened.
He did want people to believe he had almost demonic powers and could vanish in thin air and appear out of thin air.
Stelletskii knew better, of course. Ivan had used a secret tunnel to spirit himself away. Stelletskii published the story in a Moscow newspaper. Ivan's tunnel was clearly a dangerous breach in Stalin's security, and Stelletskii claimed only he could find it.
He's now going for broke. He decides to make all his findings public. That was really like playing hide and seek with death.
He's really burning his bridges all over the place, and they're ablaze. There's really no way back.
It was a message Stalin's henchmen couldn't ignore, and it wasn't long before they had Stelletskii in their sights.
The voice there says, "Comrade Stelletskii, your digging in the tunnels is starting to disturb us."
The menacing voice on the line was one of Stalin's most ruthless security chiefs. Rudolf Peterson was the commandant of the Kremlin itself, a brutal enforcer with the power of life and death.
He was responsible for the continuing good health of the Soviet leaders. That job was frightening for him, and he himself was a very frightening man. He personally would butcher people.
Peterson wanted to know all the secrets of the Kremlin's past. Terrified, Stelletskii told him about Ivan the Terrible's library and the tunnels leading from the Arsenal Tower. But then Peterson gave him the surprise of his life.
He was afraid of being arrested. But, like it often happens in Russian history, a sudden, unexpected turn of events. Instead of that, he was given a carte blanche for excavations under the Kremlin and even access to the Arsenal Tower.
Peterson wanted help to find the tunnels and close the breach in Kremlin security. Stelletskii could hardly believe his luck.
He told his diary, "I have the bluebird of happiness in my hands. At 10 o'clock on the 13th of November, 1933, I will finally be allowed back into the Kremlin."
More than 20 years after his first visit, Stelletskii re-entered the basement of the Arsenal Tower. But this time, there was no need to hide. He had Peterson's blessing and a team of engineers. His mission? To map out the Kremlin's secret tunnels and find Ivan the Terrible's library.
He can't believe his luck. It's like a miracle. He's got the keys to the Kremlin now.
Everything was just as Stelletskii had left it in 1912. But now he could explore in safety. On rediscovering the cavity in the floor, Stelletski's only thought was to find a way through to the levels below, and Ivan's secret labyrinth of white stone.
There had to be another chamber underneath, made of that same white stone.
The lifelong underground explorer was in his element. This was the breakthrough Stelletskii had always dreamed of. At last, he was about to penetrate the heart of Ivan the Terrible's labyrinth.
I mean, he must have been ecstatic.
Just as he'd expected, the tunnels were lined with white stone. Ivan the Terrible's library was hidden somewhere behind the walls.
He must have been absolutely passionate about trying to find this, as any scholar would do. Every door he opened, every hatch he lifted, every stone he unturned, his heart must have leapt, thinking he'd found things.
Stelletskii then writes a report to the commandant of the Kremlin. The tunnels, which I have been dreaming of for 25 years, have been found. I have broken through 4.5 centuries of mystery.
Stelletskii told Pettersson that it would take months to explore every inch of the tunnels. There was a clear danger from collapsing walls.
Anything can happen in a tunnel that's 400 or 500 years old. The floor can collapse under you, the roof can come in, the props can fall apart because they've rotted through. The risks are huge.
As the weeks passed, Stelletski's team suffered terrifying accidents. If the worst happened and the roof came down, they were as good as dead.
If you were doing underground exploration, the roof caved in, well, your chance of rescue was pretty slim. And if you're a long way underground, it can take hours for rescuers to get to you, by which time it's game over.
The excavation team soon tired of Stelletski's relentless quest.
The workers didn't really care about Ivan the Terrible's secret library. Why on earth should they be buried alive, working for this crazy man?
Stelletskii drove himself close to exhaustion, but he had to keep going. He knew that everyone in the Soviet Union was living on borrowed time. By 1934, Stalin's paranoia had reached its peak. He used the death of a key rival, Sergei Kirov, as a pretext for mass murder. In the Great Terror that followed, at least 1 million people died. Under torture, Stalin's old comrades from the revolution confessed to treason. After public show trials, they were brutally executed. In Stalin's Russia, the price of failure was death. In Stelletski's reports to Commandant Pettersson, he made rash promises that results were just around the corner.
March 2nd, 1934. Everywhere, we see the white stone ceiling of the Kremlin tunnels. The library of Ivan the Terrible is about to be found.
Stelletskii had evidence that he was closing in on Ivan the Terrible's greatest secrets. In the deep recesses of the labyrinth, he'd found old weapons, possibly dating from the late 16th century, a period when Ivan, like Stalin, had slaughtered his enemies in the Kremlin dungeons.
This was at the time of Ivan's Great Terror, when his secret police, their prisoners, were murdering thousands and thousands of his opponents.
The only place more secret than Ivan's dungeons was the library itself. Stelletskii was convinced it had to be nearby.
He says, "I'm sure that I'm on the verge of a great discovery.
Stelletskii pinned his hopes on one last dig through the surrounding walls, the culmination of his lifelong quest. But the result was a catastrophe. Excavations had hardly begun when the workers struck a well directly connected to the underground river nearby.
That must have been a really terrifying moment, all that water starting to pour in to the space he was working in.
Stelletski's only desperate thought was to find the library and somehow save the books.
At the very point, but he is so close to finding the library he had been looking for so many years, he could have destroyed it himself.
It was a hopeless situation. Stelletski's team could do nothing except run for their lives.
This is going to be a river, it's an unexhaustible supply of water, and it was really time to get out.
Within reach of his dream, Stelletskii was forced to leave the Kremlin behind. The commandant shut down the excavations.
He has literally undermined the Kremlin, causing damage to the substructure. And Stalin, with his henchmen, were immediately above his head.
Stelletskii is now very close to a total mental and physical breakdown. The aim of his life seems to be out of reach.
For months, as workers labored to repair the damage, Stelletskii was forced to wait at home. He was living in fear, not just for himself, but for Ivan the Terrible's library.
Stelletskii is terrified that the library will flood, or else that the workers might seal off some of the vital passageways.
He says the sword of Damocles is hanging over the library of Ivan the Terrible.
Stelletskii was hoping against hope that somehow he could survive the disaster and pick up his quest.
The only thing that can save him now is a phone call from the Kremlin, from Peterson, saying to him to carry on with his excavations.
And then the phone call comes.
But the man on the line wasn't Peterson. There was a new commandant in the Kremlin.
In 1935, in Stalin's Russia, this could only mean one thing. Peterson was as good as dead.
In the Great Terror, Stalin saw every high-ranking official as a rival. Peterson had too much power to be allowed to live.
For that crime, there was no reprieve. A bullet in the back of the neck was the only possible punishment.
In the chaos of the Great Terror, Stelletskii himself disappeared from history. In the worst-case scenario, he too had been executed, or had simply vanished into Stalin's prison camps, like countless others.
They disappeared all the time, and they would just walk out of their house to buy a loaf of bread, never to be seen again. Had someone like Stelletskii disappeared, I mean, it would have been completely unnoticed.
In the late 1950s, after Stalin's death, the mystery of Stelletski's whereabouts was finally solved. A Moscow journalist rediscovered Stelletski's diaries. They detailed his lifelong struggle through the upheavals of Russian history and his early years training as an archaeologist in Jerusalem, the ancient city where Stelletskii first learned of the sacred texts in the libraries of Ivan the Terrible.
I think that's really where he got the bug, and which drove him on to look for Ivan the Terrible's library.
For the first time, the diaries revealed that Stelletskii had a family. The journalists tracked them down at his last known address on an old Moscow street.
It was right by the Kremlin, within view of the Arsenal towers.
Stelletski's wife filled in the last tragic chapter in his story. Thwarted in his quest, Stelletskii had filled their home with his strange underground finds. A broken man, he'd cocooned himself in the secrets of the Kremlin.
This sort of obsession, which is probably bordering on madness, you know, that's the Russian scientist for you, you know.
At the end, Stelletski's mind seemed to have failed. He was losing the ability to even communicate.
Shortly before his death, as his wife later recalled, he started mumbling and bumbling something incoherent.
But this story gave the journalist an amazing idea. Remembering Stelletski's work in Jerusalem, he tried speaking a few words of Arabic to Stelletski's puzzled wife.
And she suddenly remembered one word. That's it, she said. That's what he said, maktaba. Maktaba.
Stelletskii had not been babbling. He knew exactly what he was trying to say.
Maktaba is the Arabic for library.
Stelletskii believed in the library to his dying breath. In his own mind, he was still on the quest. And in modern Moscow, his legend lives on.
Moscow has a very active community of underground explorers called the Moscow Diggers. And of course, they're still looking for the fabled legend of Ivan the Terrible's library as well.
The Diggers are still playing Stelletski's old game of hide-and-seek with the rulers in the Kremlin. They're still on the hunt for the lost library of Ivan the Terrible.
Just because Stelletskii never found Ivan the Terrible's library doesn't mean that it doesn't exist.
The library of lost masterpieces may still be waiting to rewrite the pages of history.
I do believe that Ivan the Terrible's library existed and still exists and still can be found.
I have absolutely no doubt in my mind that it did exist.
Ignatius Stelletskii may one day receive his final vindication. The treasure of the mighty Aztec emperor Montezuma. When Spanish conquistadors invaded, the breathtaking haul vanished without a trace. Legend says the riches were taken far to the north, to the fabled land of Aztlan. The quest for Aztec gold began with a drifter who believed it was buried near a small town in America.
It's here. I believe that Montezuma's treasure is here someplace.
He was followed by others who came in search of the treasure.
They were seeing all kinds of ghostly figures.
Have they awoken an army of Aztec warriors
There's people who've lost their lives.
and condemned this town to live under the curse of the fearsome Montezuma?
There is a curse that's keeping people from finding this treasure.
The quest started almost 100 years ago. One summer's day in 1914, a dusty old prospector cycled along Johnson Canyon in Utah, in the southwest of America. His name was Freddie Crystal, and he was in a hurry to get to a town called Kanab.
I am sure that the people of Kanab thought that Freddie sounded a bit mad, and he looked a bit mad. wild-eyed and crazy hair, unshaven, not the typical person that comes into town.
And Freddie Crystal certainly had a wild tale to tell. He told the people of Kanab that the treasure of Montezuma was buried near their town. If they'd help him find it, they'd all get a cut. It wasn't the sort of story these no-nonsense folk were used to hearing.
The bulk of the people who lived in Kanab were members of the Latter-day Saint religion, the Mormons, and they were small-town folk. They lived very ordinary lives. They farmed, they ranched, they ran local stores.
Kanab would have been just a little farming community, people trying to scratch a life out of the dirt.
They didn't want much to do with anything with him or his treasure at that time.
Freddie simply couldn't understand how they could turn their backs on one of the world's largest hauls of riches. When the Spanish first saw the treasure, they were awestruck by the vast array of jade, turquoise, silver, and gold. But when the conquistadors ransacked the Aztec capital, they discovered that the treasure had vanished. When faced with an agonizing death, the Aztecs still refused to reveal where the treasure had been hidden. Freddie Crystal was convinced that the priceless hoard had been spirited away to southern Utah. His belief was absolute. The story of Aztec gold had come to him in a vision.
Before Freddie ever even got to Kanab, he was a prospector up in Idaho. He was working in a mine and he got hit in the head with a crowbar, which caused him to have what he called a panorama, which for most intents and purposes we would call a vision.
In the vision, Freddie said he had seen a large number of Aztec warriors leading a massive procession of slaves. This large group headed north and crossed the Rio Grande into what is now Texas. They then traveled across New Mexico into Arizona and finally reached the Colorado River. The Aztecs and the long line of slaves moved into what is now southern Utah. But then suddenly Freddie Crystal's vision started to fade. The Aztecs and the slaves completely disappeared. Then one image slowly emerged from the haziness. It was a type of ancient rock carving known as a petroglyph. Freddie was completely baffled. Why had he seen the warriors driving a slave train thousands of miles north from the Aztec lands to what is now southern Utah? Freddie decided to find out all he could about the history of the long-lost Aztec nation. His reading led him to the events surrounding the downfall of the once mighty Aztec Empire. Although the Aztecs were renowned for ruthless cruelty and mass blood sacrifice, they initially welcomed the Spanish conquistador, Hernán Cortés. Cortés couldn't have timed his arrival better. It had been prophesied a white god would appear in 1519, and here he was, standing before them. The Spaniard wanted to see gold, and the obliging Aztecs showed their new god straight to their treasury. the conquistadors were staggered, and one of their number stated that all the riches of the world were to be found in that single room. When the inevitable hostilities broke out, the Spanish murdered Montezuma and made straight for his treasure room. But the vaults were empty. The treasure was gone. But the Spaniards hadn't traveled this far to simply give up on the biggest cache of booty they'd ever laid their eyes on. And when it came to cruelty, the conquistadors could teach the Aztecs a trick or two. They wanted that treasure and were prepared to do whatever it took to find out where it was. It was said that not a single Aztec cracked. Freddie then read later accounts, stating that the treasure had been spirited away to the north, to the fabled original homeland of the Aztecs, Aztlan, located in what is now the southwest of the USA. Legend has it that the Aztec warriors were sealed up with the treasure in a cave. Their mission, to protect their emperor's treasure from anyone who broke in to steal it. And now, at last, Freddie realized the meaning of his vision. He was convinced he'd seen the army of slaves carrying the treasure trove as far north as the Colorado River. At that point, the vision had blurred. But then one tantalizing clue was revealed, and Freddie believed this was the marker pointing to the location of Montezuma's treasure.
He did have one clue, and the clue he had was a petroglyph that had been carved onto a red wall.
But the southwestern states of America are full of red canyons, covered with thousands of petroglyphs. For Freddie to find one particular petroglyph somewhere out in the vast wilderness seemed an impossible task. Freddie Crystal had hit a brick wall. Months later, Freddie had pretty much given up on ever finding the treasure. Then one evening, after a hard day's prospecting, Freddie decided to catch up on the local news. His eye was drawn to one article. It was all about a Mormon elder, a Mr. Levi E. Young.
And he had gone down to Kanab to conduct some church business, and then had, for fun, taken some pictures and done just some sightseeing of the gorgeous country down there.
But it was the photograph that really made Freddie sit up. There was no doubt about it. It was the very same image he had seen in his panoramic vision. And Levi Young had now told him where it was. It was somewhere on a canyon wall, somewhere near a town called Kanab. Freddie jumped on his bike and headed 300 miles to the south. He was convinced he was finally honing in on the long-lost treasure. But Freddie's blind faith in his cause wasn't shared by the devout Mormons down in Kanab.
Most of the people in Kanab did not give him the time of day, but one gentleman was willing to take a chance on Freddie, and his name was Oscar Robinson. He owned a ranch, and he agreed to let Freddie come stay at his ranch.
Oscar Robinson took Freddie in and gave him free board and lodging.
This was a cowboy ranch. Oscar Robinson had a bunch of livestock, some sheep and some cows, and so he helped subsidize and give Freddie a stake.
A lot of the other ranchers didn't like Freddie. He was a bit of a freeloader, and his one purpose to be in Kanab was to find the gold.
Freddie had landed on his feet. The Robinson Ranch was right in the heart of the canyons surrounding Kanab. It was prime petroglyph hunting territory. Every morning, Freddie would set out early from the ranch. He needed to check every single yard of the vast canyons and cliffs radiating out for miles, all around Kanab.
Kanab is a town that is surrounded by beautiful red cliffs. It's rugged country. It's huge. I mean, we're almost next to the Grand Canyon.
Many of the canyon walls are covered with petroglyphs. Freddie had to check out every single one.
And so for one person to try and pinpoint the exact location was an overwhelming task.
But not for Freddie. He was a man on a mission dictated by a vision.
He searched the hills for about 2 years, all the while the ranchers at Oscar Robinson's ranch making fun of him nightly, telling him he was crazy.
Freddie would also show the photograph to anyone who would still give him the time of day. And then, in 1916, he finally got some fantastic news. One man had seen the petroglyph that Freddie thought would point him to the location of the treasure. Crystal couldn't believe how he could have overlooked it. It was just 2 miles up the road from the Robinson Ranch. And then he found out how.
Some told him that the petroglyph had been blasted off the wall.
It seems a farmer had wanted to create a shelter under the rock to store hay. And he had unwittingly reduced Freddie's vital marker to Montezuma's treasure to a sad heap of sand in an instant. Freddie Crystal seemed to have taken the news badly and vanished just as suddenly as he had appeared. And the people of Kanab assumed it was the last they would ever see of the wild-eyed man and his tall tales of lost treasure. Then, in early 1922, a familiar figure was seen cycling along Johnson Canyon.
They were very surprised 6 years later when Freddie showed up back in town.
Freddie made a beeline for the Robinson Ranch. He had some great news for his old partner, Oscar.
And he said he had spent the last 6 years in Mexico finding a map.
After the sudden destruction of the petroglyph, a desperate Freddie had recalled his fevered vision. He had seen the vast procession of slaves leave what he now knew was the capital of the Aztec Empire, Tenochtitlan. In their rage at not finding the treasure, the Spanish razed the ancient Aztec city to the ground and rebuilt it as Mexico City. Freddie traveled to the city and once there, heard an intriguing rumor. It was said that one Aztec had been caught by the Spanish and he had a map. Furthermore, the map revealed the location of Montezuma's treasure. In the mayhem during the bloody Spanish conquest, the precious map had been lost. Freddie learned that the old colonial records were stored in the basement of a monastery. So in the dead of night, Freddie Crystal jumped the wall and broke in. And finally, he found exactly what he was looking for.
The map described an area. It had a cliff. Below the cliff, there was supposed to be a marsh, and then it was surrounded by 7 mountains.
The cliffs and marshes reminded Freddie of the landscape in Johnson Canyon, but included something he had never seen on his many trips through the hills. A set of steps leading upwards. Freddie was convinced the treasure had to be hidden at the top, behind the entrance.
When Freddie returned, it was almost like a rewind. Once again, he started searching the hills. He would hike to the top of mountains with his map in hand.
Freddie was looking for a spot where he could see 7 mountains lined up, as on the map.
Once he got to the top of different cliffs and mountains, he would pull out his map and he would try to match the different geographical landmarks.
And now he had a map. Some of the younger cowboys started to show more interest in Freddie's story. Alvin Judd, Oscar Robinson's 16-year-old son-in-law, was particularly keen. In his spare time, Alvin and his pal Cowhide Adams would join Freddie on his search. Freddie told them when they found the steps, they would lead to a cave sealed up with a layer of mortar. Behind this wall would be an army of ghostly Aztec warriors standing guard over the treasure. But most of the time, Freddie was out on his own, scouring the canyons to try and find the spot where the 7 mountains all lined up. And then on Thanksgiving in 1922, Freddie scanned the horizon and suddenly stopped dead in his tracks. He pulled out his map and...
That was the day that he found the perfect match, picture perfect. Everything was there, the 7 mountains, the cliff, the marsh beneath, it all fit.
Footsore Freddie couldn't believe his luck. He had finally done it. He rounded up the young cowboys, Alvin Judd and Cowhide Adams, and they raced off to what they hoped was the cliff containing the treasure cave. Crystal scanned the canyon. He was looking for a set of steps cut into the rock face.
They found the cliff, they were at the bottom, and they saw that there were stone steps going up.
Freddie scrambled ahead, leaving the youngsters for dust.
And all the excitement and all the blood pressure went up, and here's going to be the gold.
Freddie was looking for something out of the ordinary in the rock face, some feature that didn't quite fit in.
When they got up to the mountain where the steps were, they were looking around trying to find an opening, which there wasn't, but there was a little indention.
It was though Crystal had a sixth sense. Somehow he just knew there was something special about this spot.
He actually pulled out a pocket knife right then and there.
Immediately they started digging with their pocket knives, with their hands, anything that they could open up that face with.
And beneath the soft sandy face, there was something harder.
It was like mortar in between rocks.
The mortar was made from limestone, a mineral not found in Johnson Canyon.
The closest is found 20 miles from here. So obviously, somebody had brought that here to close up that wall, and it had to be the Aztecs.
Freddie believed he was now just feet away from the riches that had been snatched away from Cortez and his conquistadors.
Any moment he knew, Freddie knew he was going to break through that wall and find a mass cavern of riches that the Aztecs had stored there.
And then suddenly, they were through.
And they figured, oh my goodness, here it is.
Freddie told the youngsters to hold back while he went in to scout out the cave. He knew the cave was reputed to be guarded by a long-dead army of Aztec warriors. Freddie edged nervously along the sandy cavern. And then...
there was actually a booby trap, and a boulder had rolled onto one of his legs and had actually pinned him there.
Was this the curse of Montezuma? Freddie desperately shouted for help, and Alvin Judd rushed to his aid.
If he had been alone, it could have been fatal. He could have died there in the caves.
There was no sign of Aztec warriors. But now they were worried. There could be more dangerous booby traps lying just up ahead.
The excitement withdrew.
The brush with death quickly sobered the mood amongst the trio of treasure hunters.
It was dangerous. It was more than they could handle.
And that's when they went to town and says, we've got to get the word out. We've got to get more people up here.
Freddie rushed back to Kanab. He was anxious to tell everyone he was on the verge of finding Montezuma's treasure. But he needed help, and lots of it.
And once word had got out that he had found the treasure cave, the whole town loved Freddie. It wasn't Freddie the freak or Freddie the weirdo anymore.
Finally convinced that Freddie may be onto something, the whole community decided to help dig out the treasure, and then they would all share out the spoils.
If you go back to the design of the community and how the western part of this country worked was community-based. So it worked the same way with this adventure on finding Montezuma's treasure. Everybody worked together.
Within days, Kanab effectively shut up shop. The townsfolk jumped in their buggies and rode to Johnson Canyon to dig out the treasure.
For a town like Kanab to completely shut down, it's really quite remarkable.
All of a sudden, a little community blossomed up down in the bottom of the canyon, and they began to dig.
They had jobs, just like as if they were in town. Some people were in charge of the water. They had people that were in charge of the cooking, the cleaning, the digging.
In the 1920s, what they used to dig with was shovels, picks, rakes, buckets, anything that they could find. Everything had to be done by hand. They'd have a bunch of buckets and a line brigade. So one would take a bucket, hand it to the next, like you're putting out a fire.
Everybody had a part, and it ran like oiled clockwork because everybody wanted that treasure.
These are ranchers, farmers, and working is their living. And so they kind of put their lives on hold for Freddie Crystal.
In the 1920s, Kanab was one of the most isolated communities in the USA. But they knew completely closing down the town could attract unwanted attention.
It was like a tent city here in Johnson Canyon, and certain people were left in town to make it look like the town was still busy and that it was thriving.
The people of Kanab were used to thinking independently. In 1912, they had appointed the world's first all-woman council.
The all-woman town council levied a fine on anyone who spoke the word treasure out loud. They wanted to take all precautions to make sure that no outsiders would hear of the treasure and try to come and claim some of the gold for themselves.
The Women Council, they put a lid on it, and that information didn't get out very far at the time.
But despite the Petticoat Council's best efforts, pretty soon rumors began to spread. Strange things were afoot down in Kane County.
There's a story of two gentlemen from Salt Lake City who managed to hear something that was going on down in Kanab, got excited about it, rode down. When they got to Kanab, everything was closed. The businesses, no one was home.
Apparently, a stable lad let the cat out of the bag and pointed the strangers towards Johnson's Canyon.
When they got there, they didn't get very close to where the people were working and before someone pulled a gun on them and said, "You need to leave." And they did.
Untroubled by intruders, the big dig continued apace. When they got to the end of the first cave, they broke through a wall, but found yet another series of caverns stretching back into the mountain. There was no sign of gold, just tons of dirt.
People were starting to doubt that there was actually even any treasure to be found.
That next shovelful, because that's what kept everybody going. It's just going to be the next shovelful. But when does that next shovelful stop?
One by one, people were beginning to lose faith in Freddie Crystal.
Slowly, people started to give up the search and would, gradually head back to their farms and their families and their way of life again.
But a hardcore of diggers carried on, driven on by thoughts of treasure.
I'm sure that there was a lot of people felt, you know, just one more shovelful.
And after 2 long years, the remaining gold diggers were finally on the verge of breaking through to the last cavern.
Everybody was seeing gold in their eyes. Any moment, the next shovelful, they're gonna get it.
They finally broke through the cave wall, but were faced with a heartbreaking sight.
Somebody told me they found an old Spaniard helmet. I think a half of a moccasin they found back in there. There wasn't much for as much time as they spent. There wasn't any gold. They certainly didn't find any gold. I can't imagine what their hearts might have felt.
But Freddie Crystal had spent well over 10 years looking for the treasure, and he wasn't about to quit now.
Freddie himself was discouraged, so he took another look at the map. And it hit him that the tunnels were probably just a temporary holding of the treasure, and that the place they really needed to look was underneath all of the material they had just removed from the cave.
So Freddie said, you know what? We have got to dig here where we have been throwing all this stuff for 2 years.
Freddie's sudden change of plan went down like a lead balloon.
The townspeople were not happy with this. They had just spent, I don't know, quite a long time emptying the tunnels to then be told they needed to move the very same material once again. And they lost interest.
In 1924, the empty-handed townsfolk finally abandoned the dig and turned their backs on the man who had filled their heads full of treasure.
Freddie just disappeared one day, and nobody really knew what happened to Freddie. Some speculated that the townspeople got angry at him and someone murdered him.
It was said he was murdered in fury for all the wasted time. Some thought he was killed for his map, but others believed he had incurred the wrath of Montezuma and thought he may not be the last to die searching for the treasure. But Alvin Judd kept his faith in Freddie and his tales of Aztec gold, and when he had any spare time,
He was up there digging, my grandfather, and with his brothers. He spent 30 years or more up there.
Alvin found no trace of the legendary gold. But it wasn't to be the last the Judd family were to hear about Montezuma and missing Aztec treasure. Freddie Crystal had arrived at Oscar Robinson's ranch in 1914. Almost 70 years later, another stranger showed up, talking about Montezuma and his long-lost treasure. His name was Raymond Dillman.
The Dillmans showed up, and my mother was there alone this particular day.
And this old green van drove up. And it was full of these Spanish-looking people, and they were big people.
My mother was kind of scared because it was, you know, she's out there alone.
And they didn't dare get out of the van. My mom tells this story lots better than I do.
When I saw the occupants in there, it really quite frightened me for a minute, you know, and I thought, oh no, what would I do? You know, well, the dogs took care of it.
And those old dogs probably would have licked you to death. Other than that, they would have done a thing to you, but they had a big bark.
Orrinell Judd eventually summoned up all her courage.
I went over there and he asked me if there were any hieroglyphics on the walls.
And she says, yeah, there's some right there by the house.
And he said, well, can I see them? He said, sure. So she walked over there and showed him.
Raymond Dillman was looking for petroglyphs of 3 animals, all in a line. Below them, 3 circles.
And it was the exact pictures that he was looking for.
But there was one final image Dillman needed to account for.
Well, do you have this big bullseye? Yeah, there's one down the canyon.
The bullseye petroglyph, a 9-spiraled circle, confirmed Ray Dillman's theory.
And he says, the Montezuma treasure is buried on your property. said, oh, really?
Is that what turned your hair white?
Yes, all of a sudden.
Any other family would probably have politely asked Ray Dillman to leave, but not the Judds.
It's unusual, and it pricked our interests because naturally it was in our family, or we'd been part of Freddie Crystal and the whole 9 yards, and then to have somebody else come out of the blue and come right to there, and then for us to be able to take him right to the picture because we knew they were there.
It's been in my family a long time. And this Dillman story of coming to our doorstep and continuing the saga in the 70s, early 80s, was amazing to us.
Raymond Dillman told the Judds he had spent the previous 16 years studying a curious set of tablets called the Peralta Stones. The stones were found in the 1950s, buried by a highway in Arizona. The Peralta Stones are thought by some to be a map to the legendary Dutchman's Mine in Arizona. But Ray Dillman believed the stones had led him directly to the petroglyphs on the Judd Ranch, what he claimed was the site of Montezuma's treasure.
The picture of the horse's head and so forth is what was on the ranch. The rest of the tablets actually had the map, the etchings of the map to how that's how they got there. That's how they got to Johnson Canyon.
Dillman claimed both Aztec and Native American ancestry, and this had enabled him to decipher the symbols on the stones. And if the stone map was good enough for Ray Dillman, it was sure good enough for Bruce and Brent Judd. The brothers got themselves an excavator and headed down the canyon, aiming straight for the bullseye.
And we started digging this place out.
In the 1920s, the whole town of Kanab had turned out with buckets and spades. 60 years later, it was just 2 men, but they had their heavyweight excavator.
The amount of dirt that we moved was 30 or 40 or 50 times more than what they did. When you think that they didn't have any equipment, everything was handmade.
After a few days of digging, there was a huge pile of dirt and rock at the base of the cliff. The ground under the 9-spiral bullseye was now exposed, and they soon made a grisly find. Bones. Lots of bones.
Half their bodies had been burned. We're going, oh my gosh, he told us they were going to be here.
But it wasn't just bones. They hit a ledge, and suddenly a small object tumbled down towards them.
And it came running down towards us, and we all backed up and thought, oh my heck, this is a skull coming after us. And come to find out, it was just a pot, had clay on the top of it, and inside was 213 turquoise beads.
It wasn't yet Montezuma's treasure, but it seemed a very good sign of the riches to come.
So you can imagine how our hearts were pumping. You can imagine the gold in our eyes.
Just above the site was a strange-looking rock that further encouraged the brothers that they were on the right track.
We call it the sacrificial stone. It was big enough that a man 6 or 7 foot tall could be laid out on this stone, and it had a drain line where it would actually drain off the face of the cliff down off this face.
The find had the brothers reaching for their history books. They quickly learned all about the Aztecs' fondness for blood sacrifice. So had they found the execution site of the slaves who had carried the treasure from the Aztec capital in the early 1500s?
My thought was, dang, this is a place where they sacrificed, because the blood could naturally go off the edge of the cliff.
We figured it was that they were probably the Aztecs and that they'd beaten the people.
And when they excavated further under the cliff, they found a set of flat stones.
We'd take that cover stone off, and the hole was completely full of sand. We'd go in and dig out that hole, go down about 8 feet, and then we thought we had a tunnel. Here's the entrance to the cave. Montezuma's is just the next shovelful. 2 feet in diameter, just enough for one person to get down in there. And guess what we found? Bodies.
There were stones placed over the openings. And the first one that we opened up was just chock-a-block full of bones, human bones. The bones had been cannibalized, they'd been eaten.
The Judd brothers had clearly uncovered a burial ground. But could the bones be the remains of Aztec slaves that had carried the treasure far from the south? The answer turned out to be no. Carbon dating revealed the skeletons were from around 2000 BC, predating the fall of Montezuma by 3,500 years. These were not the bones of the Aztec slaves. It was a body blow for Brent and Bruce, and they called a halt to their hunt. However, the brothers remain convinced that Montezuma's treasure exists, and it is out here in the wild country surrounding Kanab.
It's here. It's definitely here.
It's here. I believe that Montezuma's treasure is here someplace.
And Bruce now claims he knows where some of the treasure is actually hidden.
I can probably say that I know where part of it is, but I'm not, I'll never go to it. I'll never go after it.
Bruce now believes it is far too dangerous to hunt the treasure.
Yeah, there's people who've lost their lives. The one took his boy back to see it, and a rattlesnake actually killed his son. And so there's some wild stories back in there. They've actually had some of the old Indians come back and say, "It's not time, leave it alone."
The fact that the treasure may be cursed was whispered around Kanab, but it didn't deter everyone in town. Brant Child was a good friend of the Judds, but he was convinced the treasure wasn't at their ranch. He thought it was hidden under this lake, just north of Kanab. He too believed the Aztecs finally halted here after fleeing the Spanish, and that this was part of their legendary homeland, Aztlan.
These Aztecs decided they had to leave and take their treasure elsewhere. So they came back to their homeland, back to this country. And they knew they had to put it someplace where Cortez wouldn't get it.
Brant Child said that when the Aztecs arrived here, the lake didn't exist. The slaves had dug a tunnel into the cliff, walled up the treasure, then flooded the valley. His son Lon explains.
There was probably around 4,000 to 6,000 warriors. The theory is that they actually killed the warriors that brought the gold here. And the Aztecs believed in the afterlife. And so their assignment was to protect this area.
But thousands of dead Aztec warriors were not going to deter a man like Brant Child.
And he wanted to go after something, he really went after it.
Brant brought in dive teams to explore the underwater cave. But the divers quickly swam into trouble.
We had a professional group of divers out of San Francisco that came down. They came down with $100,000 worth of equipment. What happened with them is their equipment kept breaking down. And they just had all kinds of trouble.
Linda lost her air. And when we got back out, Linda's air tank had been turned completely off. Nothing wrong with the tank itself. She had plenty of air in the tank, but it had just been turned off.
The divers could offer no rational explanation for the constant equipment malfunctions. But they all agreed that there was something strange happening in the underwater cavern.
They were seeing all kinds of ghostly figures, a lot of crazy things.
He says, I'm being choked, I'm being choked. I can see ghostly figures all around me and they're choking me. I can't breathe, I can't breathe. Get me out, get me out.
Tony Thurber had been a professional diver for over 20 years.
I've been diving all over the world and I've never had a terrifying experience as scary as this one was.
And it wasn't just the diver who had a close brush with death that day.
We woke up late that night and the room was full of propane gas. And propane is very deadly. And so we had to leave the room, and I have no idea why it leaked. It had never leaked before and never leaked after.
Although strange, inexplicable things were happening in the cave, there was no shortage of fresh divers ready to take up the challenge.
There was many different divers that came down and had pretty much the same experience almost every time.
Every single dive ended in failure. Brant Child now decided on a radical solution.
The easiest way would have been to access the treasure would have been just to drain the lake. And what Dad wanted to do to drain it actually is just dig a big trench and drain it out into a field.
But there was a problem.
The federal government got wind of that, and they went to Dad and they threatened him. They said, "You don't touch that lake."
The US Fish and Wildlife Department informed Brand his lake was home to a critically endangered subspecies, the Kanab amber snail. Killing just one snail would leave Brand picking up a bill for $50,000. Lon believes it's no coincidence that the rare snails live in the lake. He believes they were put there to guard the treasure.
The Aztecs used a golden snail in their religious rituals. So the theory is that the Aztecs brought their golden snail from Mexico and planted it where they planted the gold. The amber snail is a means of protecting access to the treasure.
With the amber snails successfully blocking the lake route, Brant now hatched a new plan. He brought in a crew to drill down into the cave. But then one of the crew had an unusual experience.
He said, "It's the strangest thing because I looked over on this knoll and there was an Indian standing there in full Indian garb and he was holding a spear." And I said, "Oh, come on." And he said, "Well, I started going about my business again, and then I looked back to see if he was still there and he was gone."
If this was a warning, the drillers chose to ignore it. And it wasn't long before they broke through to a cavern. And when they brought the drill bit up, they were staggered.
When they pulled the drill bit out, it was flakes of gold on the drill bit tip.
It was an amazing development, and they needed to see just what was down in the cave.
They decided that they'd put a little camera down there, and the story is that when they got the camera in the cavern, they could see a statue and a pile of something.
He said he could see something in the middle of the room that was piled up in the middle of the room, and then he said he'd seen an image over to the side of the door where he figured the door was at, that there was somebody standing there.
Some say it wasn't a statue, it was a figure of a man, and then this pile that they couldn't make out because they didn't have enough lighting. Yeah, they were very excited.
But the excitement of the find was to be overshadowed by tragedy.
And that well driller went home that night and he had a heart attack and died. And then what I understand is a few weeks later, his wife died too.
His own brother won't come to this very day and get the drilling rig that's still parked right up there up on top.
And then, Brant got a visit from a mysterious Native American.
Dad said, "Well, that was the strangest thing. This Indian just came out and he told me that the treasure was here, but it is to be used for the Indians, to unite the Indian tribes, and that bad things would happen to you if you continue to go after it, so you need to quit trying to go after it."
And this wasn't the end of the strange incident.
They both started walking back, following his tracks in this sand, and after a while, his tracks just disappeared. My dad got to the point where he truly believed that it was probably just protected and it wasn't meant to come out, and so he gave up trying.
We can't disturb it. It's designed, it's hid up, and it's protected by these warriors that were left here.
Brant finally decided to give up his pursuit of Montezuma's treasure. In September 2002, he died in a traffic accident. Some consider the circumstances surrounding his death as somewhat mysterious.
Brant Childs was killed in Marysville Canyon when he hit a horse in the canyon. A lot of people think it could have been because he disturbed the treasure. Some people believe it's cursed.
It's been cursed with a curse to protect it.
Some now believe that the treasure belongs to the descendants of the Aztecs, the Native American people.
The legend says that there's a chosen one and that he will be able to come and access the treasure and then it will be used for the Indians.
Like I say, when the time's right, then it'll come out.
Lon Child has brought a halt to any attempts to get hold of the treasure at the lake.
We're gonna let the Aztecs sleep. Yeah, they can have their treasure.
Today, many in Kanab are convinced that the 6,000 Aztec warriors continue their silent vigil. They believe the warriors await anyone reckless enough to disturb the treasure of their long-dead emperor, the mighty Montezuma. Joan of Arc is France's most famous patron saint. Burned at the stake, her remains were said to have been lost, thrown into the River Seine. Until in 1867, her bones appeared out of the blue.
It's a bit like crime scene investigation. You have the remains. Who do they belong to?
Some thought it was a hoax, others the real deal. France's leading forensic pathologist, Dr. Philippe Charlier, became fascinated by this mysterious and macabre cold case.
They are not just bones for me, they are patients.
A detective tale that tested Charlier's expertise to the limit. The autopsy of an international icon, where science meets myth.
It connects you to the past in a very unexpected way.
This is the story of Charlier's quest to find the truth behind the relics that could be Saint Joan of Arc. Paris, France, 2006. Dr. Philippe Charlier was a pathologist. His patients were the city's dead, dissecting their bodies for clues about why they died. But he was also France's most famous forensic sleuth, dubbed the Indiana Jones of graveyards. He couldn't resist the coldest cases, long-dead kings, queens, and mistresses, whose deaths were shrouded in mystery.
I'm a physician, first of all, not an archaeologist or anthropologist. So they are not just bones for me, they are patients. And I look at them as if it would be anybody in the subway or on the streets, but dead, of course.
His patient files include the English King Richard the Lionheart and the French King Henry IV, but all the remains, however small, held secrets from the past.
Even just a tiny bone, for me, it's a patient. All these bodies are, for me, patients, and when I look at their bones, I'm just looking like in a patient's file, like a historian book.
Charlier was destined to become a myth hunter, and it all began on a trip to the Italian city of Pompeii when he was just 7 years old. A volcano had erupted in 79 AD, burying buildings in boiling ash. People were frozen in time.
I remember the cadaver of a woman, and this was very important for me because I was facing not a skeleton but the three-dimensional form of a dead individual, and I wanted to make this individual speaking to me.
By 10 years old, Charlier had found a human skull, someone who died some 1,300 years before. He wanted the dead to tell him their story, to speak to him through their remains. So he went on to forge a career in medicine. As a forensic pathologist, he knew he could search for the truth behind history's most famous deaths. In 2006, Charlier had just closed his latest case. He was returning the medieval remains of a king's mistress to a provincial museum in Chinon, central France, when by chance he spotted his next patient.
50 centimeters close to these remains were the relics of the so-called Joan of Arc.
Charlier had discovered a long-forgotten box of bones, but these were no ordinary remains. Legend said they belonged to France's patron saint, Joan of Arc. But how did they find their way to Chinon? Charlier learnt the bones trace back to Paris in 1867. Vast swathes of the capital were being knocked down for one of the most ambitious urban transformations ever attempted.
Dr. Charlier wanted to know where they'd come from and found out that in 1867 the attic of a pharmacy had been cleared out and these remains had been found.
Near the Place de la République, a pharmacist was clearing his shop's attic before demolition, when he claimed to make an extraordinary discovery. Jars filled with bones, a textile fragment, and a lid inscribed with a message: the remains of Joan of Arc. The Catholic Church took an immediate interest.
The Roman Catholic Church had the remains examined to see whether they could tell whether they were Joan of Arc's. They sort of accepted that they were, but it wasn't a definitive conclusion.
The clergy took the remains to Chinon for safekeeping, where they eventually landed up in the local museum.
So these relics were then left on a shelf for nearly 150 years until they were rediscovered by Charlier.
Charlier had little evidence to work with. A broken piece of human rib, a fragment of vertebrae from a spine, the end of a cat's thigh bone, a curious scrap of fabric, and what looked like lumps of charcoal. He faced one of his most difficult investigations, and he'd need a crack team if he was to solve the case.
It's a bit like CSI, crime scene investigation, using a whole range of different experts, many different methods of analysis to determine whether, in this case, relics belonged to Joan of Arc.
Yes, it was interesting to study these bones, which were absolutely black and that could have been burnt.
The blackened bones instantly reminded Charlier of the history lesson every French child learned in school.
Joan of Arc is a peasant girl, and she emerges out of nowhere, really, of almost total obscurity, and erupts onto the historical scene in the most unexpected of ways. She starts to hear voices, and these voices are those of the saints. The voices tell her that she is the virgin who will save France, and that her mission is to ensure that the true King of France, who is the Dauphin Charles, will become crowned.
It was 1422. France was in the grip of a power struggle with England. That went on so long, it became known as the 100 Years' War. The French King Charles VI had just died. The English were determined to stop his son, the Dauphin, Charles, from taking the crown. In 1429, Joan rode to the Dauphin's court at the fortress of Chinon. She told the French prince of her quest to defeat the English, hand him the throne, and restore peace.
We don't know exactly what she told the Dauphin in secret. What was the sign that she gave which convinced him and many of them that she was the true virgin who was going to save France?
Whatever she said, it worked. Joan became his military advisor. She was just 16 years old.
She seems to be quite willing to adopt the role of a warrior, and this is very unusual. She is someone who seems to be able to take on military command. She bears a banner, a standard, which is her emblem and symbol.
She thwarted the English armies in battle and saw the Dauphin crowned King Charles VII of France. But a year later, in 1430, in the midst of a battle, Joan was captured by pro-English French troops. Then betrayed by her king, who refused to pay her ransom. Charles VII knew she'd become a dangerous liaison. The church was convinced the voices she heard weren't the saints, but the devil.
She is no longer worth supporting. He must not be seen to have owed anything, least of all his kingdom or his crown, to somebody who is accused of being a heretic.
Joan was imprisoned. She refused to renounce the voices she heard, certain they were the word of God. The church wasn't impressed.
She confuses and disconcerts her interrogators. She treats them in what they regard as an extremely disrespectful way, telling them that they can't have an answer now, they have to wait for a fortnight because her voices will have spoken by then and she will then be able to communicate God's message to them, which, if the clergy are not part of that communication with God, is heretical.
A show trial found her guilty of heresy, and there was no leniency in the sentence.
The normal punishment for the heretic who is obdurate and refuses to recant or abjure their heresy, which is the dreadful, dreadful punishment of burning at the stake.
On the 30th of May, 1431, Joan was tied to a stake above a pyre of wood in Rouen market square. A vast crowd was said to have gathered to watch the spectacle. The pyre was lit. It took 3 attempts to burn her body to ash.
What was remaining of the poor girl was deposited as ashes into the River Seine. It was highly important that there should be no relics left.
"575 years later, Charlier gazed at a labelled jar. It said, "Remains found under the pyre of Joan of Arc, Virgin of Orleans." Could her body have survived the fire? For Philippe Charlier, this was the opportunity of a lifetime to examine relics rumoured to be France's most famous daughter. As a pathologist who'd analysed anonymous human body parts found by the police, Charlier knew one diagnostic test reigns supreme:
DNA analysis has been described as being the silver bullet to all questions, particularly in the past.
The double helix, DNA, was Charlier's best chance of proving the bones were Joan of Arc. A molecule found in all animal and plant cells, DNA is encoded with vital genetic information, passed down from one generation to another.
If Charlier could actually get preserved DNA out of the human remains, it would be possible, one, to determine the sex of the person represented, and two, to compare the DNA profile with living descendants.
Charlier knew DNA could last in human remains for hundreds, even thousands of years. So he sent bone samples to forensic genetics experts. If the remains were female, he planned to obtain DNA from her relatives alive today to identify a genetic link with the relic bones.
DNA analysis has really been around only about 25 years for looking at archaeological skeletons. 1989 was the first time DNA was extracted from bone.
Charlier awaited the results. If the bones were male, it'd mark the sudden end to his quest.
Would have been a male, we would have concluded that these remains were absolutely not these of Joan of Arc.
Then Charlier got the call. It was bad news. The scientists had failed to extract any DNA. His plan to test her relatives for a genetic match now lay in tatters. The reason why there was no DNA was a mystery. But was it possible intense heat, like a burning pyre, could have destroyed it?
So there are two reasons why the DNA wouldn't have survived, and that would be that it didn't survive full stop, or that it was destroyed. It's very unlikely to get preserved DNA out of bone that has been cremated.
Charlier suspected high-tech science might not give him the breakthroughs he'd need to crack this cold case. To unravel the mystery of the relics of Joan of Arc, he knew he'd have to think outside the box. He had a radical idea, something never attempted before. And he'd need one of France's most highly trained noses.
I am a perfumer, I create perfumes, I smell so many things in life, and I have a passion for nice odors like flowers, fruits, spices, woods, etc. And suddenly you have someone calling you and say, "Oh, hello Jean-Michel, I am a doctor, I work in a hospital, and I am investigating on the supposed relics of Joan of Arc. Can you help me?"
I wanted to use noses of perfumers, which are professional noses and quite artistic one also, in order to smell these remains and to know if they have been burned or not.
To smell the relics, to see if there's evidence of burning, I think is wonderful. Use any test you can.
The sense of smelling is really about detecting molecules, volatile molecules that are here in the air. Sometimes quite a few molecules are enough to be detected. They come into your nose, and your nose captures them and sends an olfactive information to your brain.
Like a sommelier's palate for the complex taste of wine, Jean-Michel Durier's senses were finely tuned to sniff odors with precision. He'd be the first to put the smell of the relics under scrutiny. He met Charlier at the hospital laboratory. Some of the bottles hadn't been opened for at least 30 years. Charlier hoped the scent would be concentrated enough for a result.
We were just, placing our nose on the bottle very carefully, as if also, this dead person would be still alive and we don't want to bother her too much. So, "Excuse me, madam, but can I smell your burnt bones?" That was a bit strange.
Durier sniffed the blackened 10-centimeter long rib fragment.
Knowing the history of Joan of Arc, I was expecting maybe to smell a burnt odor. And I was surprised because I didn't smell anything burnt.
There was no trace scent of fire, but Durier did detect a faint but dense aroma, evidence that the relics were old. Scent is made of molecules called notes, which have different weights. Top notes give the strongest smell, but they're so lightweight they evaporate away in minutes. Bottom notes are the heaviest scent molecules, lingering for hours, perhaps even centuries.
What we call the top notes are the volatile notes, were completely disappeared. So what I was smelling was more into what we call the dry down or the bottom note, very heavy and soft type of note.
And the bottom note smelled curiously of vanilla.
I am smelling a sort of vanillic note. Is that possible? Is that any possible that a burnt bone can smell like vanilla?
A vanilla scent was an important clue. It's linked to the sweet smell of bodies as they decay.
Vanillin is in direct relationship with decomposition and putrefaction. So these remains are still continuing their decomposition and putrefaction process.
But the smell of decay didn't rule out that the body had been burnt on a wood pyre. The relics could still be Joan of Arc.
Just because there was a smell of vanilla doesn't necessarily mean that the body was not cremated, because cremated bone can degrade following the cremation.
Charlier needed to check if the bones had been burned, to look for direct evidence of exposure to the intense heat of fire. But to see it, he'd need X-ray vision. He called on radiologists to put the relics through their CT scanner, normally used to analyze living bodies, organs, and tumors.
It's an X-ray technique. It produces slices, which are images through the object or the body, and then those images are then reconstructed into a 3D picture.
Charlier wanted to scan the bone fragments from different angles to generate a 3D model of the bones, revealing the inside and the outside surfaces in minute detail. And he had a clever idea how to identify any evidence of burning on the relics.
Dr. Charlier did have control samples, particularly from victims of burning, so that he could actually compare what he saw in the relics with the modern victims.
The body is cremated on public places or in a car, in private place. It's much more close to Joan of Arc death process.
Charlier would check both the relics and modern bones for cracks in their structure, created when bones are exposed to temperatures above 70 degrees Celsius and the bone's collagen starts to disintegrate.
What we wanted to know if these remains have been burnt with the identification of little fractures or trauma.
The 3D models were generated on screen, and Charlier had his answer.
We saw that there were absolutely no cremation sign on the screen.
The results suggested the relics had not been burned, but Charlier wondered if the Joan of Arc legend could explain why. It takes half a ton of wood and 5 hours to cremate a body. And the history book said it took 3 attempts to burn Joan of Arc's corpse. She died in the first fire, probably from carbon monoxide poisoning, but the flames had not destroyed her body.
The body was quite intact. Only the extremities of the fingers and toes were cremated. So the English people and authorities wanted to burn it a second time.
A second pyre was lit. Joan's arms, head, and legs were burned away, but not her torso, containing the wettest organs, her lungs, heart, liver, and intestines.
It's possible after the second burning that there was just the torso left, maybe because that's got the most moisture in it, and therefore a third burning was needed to get rid of the rest of the body.
The relic bones would have come from her torso. Charlier wondered if they could have been saved from the third fire, which finally incinerated her body.
We had two possible explanations about the conservation of little relics of Joan of Arc. The first one, that as the pyre was not on the ground but upstairs, it may be possible that some bones passed from the support down to the ground.
Could the fallen bones have been saved by the jostling crowd? Or had Joan of Arc's corpse reacted to fire just like Hindu pyre funerals and modern cremations? Had the torso exploded?
The other possibility was possible explosions of the body of Joan of Arc. We got a lot of gas that grew inside the trunk, and the pressure grows, and after, of course, it explodes because the lungs and the ribs cannot support such high pressure.
It is a known phenomenon that bodies do explode during the burning process, so his second explanation could be true.
But Charlier's theory of why the bones hadn't burned didn't account for the radiologist's second discovery. The bones were permeated by a mysterious dark substance that had once been very hot.
To infiltrate the bone, the black substance would have needed to be liquefied, which suggests that there was some high temperature involved somewhere. Dr. Charlier had to look under a microscope to find out what was actually in it.
Charlier scraped samples of the black coating from the relics. If the bones had been exposed to fire, Charlier thought he might see charcoal particles under the microscope.
He found a lot of things, including red blood cells, vegetable fibres, a dog hair, and various other things, but no charcoal.
But Charlier's analysis did reveal the substance was a resin.
We saw that it was a mixture of organic putrefacted material and also a large quantity of pollens.
Pollen grains and fungal spores, which then gave him the result that this was actually a resin from pine tree.
Charlier knew pine sap resin had been used for millennia to preserve bodies. If the remains were Joan of Arc, had someone soaked the relics in resin to prevent decay? Charlier wanted to know if all the relics were coated in the same resin. Did it hold any secrets about where or when the bones had been preserved? So he called on a long-time collaborator at the Hospital Lariboisière, Paris. Toxicologist Dr. Joel Poupon.
I know Philippe Charlier for a long time, more than 10 years, and when he wants something, he will have it. And so he is very persuasive, and you cannot resist, in fact. For him, all is possible.
Unlike Charlier, Poupon's patients are usually alive. He looks for the chemical traces of poisoning or certain diseases in their bodies. But he can find elements in archaeological remains too. He's helped solve some of Charlier's most complex cases. But an alleged saint, permeated by resin, was a first.
All the relics, the bones were covered with a very dark substance coating. And it was very intriguing. So we wanted to know if the substance was the same for all the samples and what it was exactly.
Poupon's experiment would reveal the exact chemical makeup of the resin covering each of the relics. Were they all coated with the same substance?
They also put in 2 lots of control samples, one of which was 2 bones from modern cremations, and the other was a piece of dried skin.
Charlier demanded absolute secrecy about the case. Poupon wasn't to breathe a word.
I didn't know who were working on it, and so we were supposed not to talk about it to the press or the media.
To identify the elements in the resin, Poupon had to dissolve the samples in acid, heated to 5,000 degrees.
So you put your sample with the acid in the microwave, you heat, and all is dissolved. Not exactly the same used in your kitchen, but the principle is the same.
Then Poupon ran the liquid through his mass spectrometer, which would identify and count the atoms in the samples. Charlier wanted the results straight away.
You know, Philippe Charlier is very impatient, and especially for this kind of very important study, he wants to know very quickly the results. So he phoned me and, Joël, what are the results? I need it tomorrow.
The outcome was clear. Poupon proved the relics were all coated with the same resin. But this group included the anonymous skin fragment too.
It seemed there were two different groupings according to his analyses. One was the modern cremations, and the second grouping was the relics and the skin sample.
The relics and the skin sample were loaded with the metals iron and phosphorus, further proof the bones had decayed, not been cremated.
So the high levels of phosphorus and iron in the relics and the skin indicates the decay process that goes on in the muscles and skin.
The modern bones had a different chemical composition. There was no link with the relic resin. Now, Charlier revealed the source of the skin fragment.
So then what Charlier said to Poupon was, well, actually, that skin sample was from an Egyptian mummy.
Charlier had sent the skin sample to test a secret idea, that the relics were coated with a resin recipe invented by the ancient Egyptians. He was right. It was a major breakthrough in the case.
The blackish mixture was, of course, bitumen and kind of balm deposed during the embalming process. These results confirmed us that we had a kind of unity. The coating was exactly the same for all the samples.
Charlier was determined to find out whether the relics could be Joan of Arc, and he knew of a test that could help him peer back into the past. Zurich, Switzerland, scientists at the Ion Beam Physics Laboratory were world experts at dating human remains by analyzing a radioactive molecule, carbon-14.
In a way, we are radioactive just by nature. Our atmosphere, our planet is exposed to cosmic radiation, and these high energetic cosmic particles finally ends up in all living organisms, also in our body.
Carbon-14 is found in every cell in our bodies, and as soon as we die, it works like a ticking clock. Because it's radioactive, carbon-14 decays at a known rate, so scientists would count the number of the molecules left in the relic bones to tell Charlier when the person had died.
We wanted to know, of course, the datation of the relics. We wanted to know if it had exactly the same period as Joan of Arc.
As soon as we die, we can't replace the C14 atoms anymore. And at that moment, the clock starts running. And from this, we can calculate directly the age. The cleaned sample material, we first burn it to carbon dioxide, purify the gas, and then we reduce it again to graphite. And this little graphite powder is pressed into these bullets.
The bullet-like capsules were loaded into the accelerator. Charlier wanted to find out if the relics were medieval or not. But he also wanted to know their geographic origin. So he called on textile historian Christophe Moulerat to analyze the fabric found in the jar.
Philippe called me to say, Christophe, I've got a fragment from the relics of Jeanne d'Arc. He wants to extract the more information possible from everything.
It'd be one of the most perplexing cases Moulerat had ever faced.
Analysing the textile was really important. It potentially can show you when it was actually manufactured, where it was manufactured, what the actual cloth was.
He had just a small scrap of fabric to analyse, which was coated on one side with the embalming resin found on the bones.
The textile was a fragile 10 centimeters length part of tissue with a blackish and brownish coloration and black formations incrusted on one part of the textile.
Moulerat wanted to know what the material was made of, then its thread count, to see if it matched medieval fabrics.
So when I study the thread, I find it's linen, but the material was very fine also, very good quality. When I make the count of the thread, I find 24 centimeters.
The fabric was flax linen with 24 threads per centimetre square, a fine fabric, widespread in Europe for the last 1,000 years. But as he looked under the microscope, something strange caught Moulerat's expert eye. He knew that from the 7th century, European thread was twisted in a Z direction. But the relic thread had an opposite twist, like an S.
The thread used to make the textile was always in Z direction. And in this textile, it's S. It's opposite direction. So it's very strange.
He expected a Z twist to the thread and he found an S twist. So he had to start thinking where that textile might have come from.
There was no match with European-made fabric, but Moulerat had seen this twist before.
All the textile from the Middle East, all the material is in S direction.
Could the fabric have been exported to France from the Middle East in the 15th century? Could the strange cat femur found in the relics give any further clues? Charlier had heard that in the late Middle Ages, some people believed the devil could transform himself into a cat. They were said to be associated with witchcraft and heresy, and rumoured to have been thrown on pyres when witches were burned. At least 12,000 heretics died at the stake in Europe and America between 1300 and 1800 AD. But up to 100,000 could have been killed. Joan of Arc's death was the most well-documented of them all. But there had been no mention of a cat.
When we saw the femur, first of all, we were not sure that it was a cat, and we wanted to show it to a specialist.
Archaeozoologist Marie-Alain Patou-Matisse measured the femur.
Bat Matisse was looking at a fragment of this cat's femur. People who study human remains have an easy job because there's just one species there. So you want to know what species it is, you want to know what bone it is. You may be able to determine how old the animal was when it died. And she was able to determine the total length, if she had had the whole femur, from analysing it. And she decided that on the basis of that, this femur did not come from a European domestic cat and may have come from somewhere like Egypt.
It took 4 weeks for the carbon dating team to complete their tests and to analyse the data. Charlier had a clear result.
For this specific object, we measured the radiocarbon age of 2,355 years. This goes back in the ancient times. It was from the 7th century to the 3rd century before Christ.
The bones were between 1,000 and 600 years older than the date when Joan of Arc died. The question mark that hung over the relics led to one answer. They were a fake.
These remains are not these of Joan of Arc. Joan of Arc existed, but her remains are not in the glass jar.
So we now have the final results of the analysis of these relics, that they don't belong to Joan of Arc. But who do they belong to?
The cat femur was from a large breed found in Egypt, and the fabric twist linked to the Middle East. The bones had been embalmed with a resin just like the recipe used to embalm ancient Egyptians. And the carbon date proved the person lived in late antiquity, the time of the last pharaohs. All the evidence suggested Charlier's patient was an Egyptian mummy.
If these remains are not the good one, it's much more interesting to know when it was created, from which artifact, and what was the manner of making this forgery.
For Charlier, his investigation was far from over. He was determined to get to the bottom of why this elaborate forgery had been made. Charlier had been drawn into the mystery by the handwritten label, proclaiming the relics were Joan of Arc. Could the text and the glass jars give up the last clues he needed to wrap up the case? Antique expert Robert Montezuma took a look.
The cover is still intact with an inscription on it. It's a kind of parchment, and with an inscription handmade on it, reste trouvé sous le bûcher de Jeanne d'Arc, Pucelle d'Orléans.
The text read, "Remains found under the pyre of Joan of Arc, Virgin of Orléans." The Virgin was a name Joan had used for herself in the 15th century. But the moniker had been revived by the French poet Voltaire in his 1755 poem mocking her purity. There was another clue in the glass itself. The jars were hand-blown and cut off at the base, designed in the 18th century for scientists. Perhaps not out of place in a pharmacy.
The glass jar has been broken very recently, almost 40 or 30 years ago, not before. But the jar was not dating back from Joan of Arc, but it was from the 18th century. And the inscription was very recent, but with an archaic style.
The forger had attempted antiquated writing, but it didn't fool the expert. It certainly wasn't medieval, nor 18th century, but a 19th century hand. Instead of finding the relics, Charlier wondered if the pharmacist had made the forgery in 1867, putting some mummy remains in glass jars and passing them off as Joan of Arc. But why go to all of that effort? The relics had turned up when French society was in the midst of a radical transformation. In 1456, Joan's reputation had been restored when a retrial cleared her of heresy. By the 1860s, she'd become a symbol used by three groups who were hijacking her reputation to gain power.
One has to remember the extreme fierceness of the controversies that divide France in the late 19th century over the separation of church and state. And Joan of Arc becomes a symbol in that conflict. On the one hand, the Republicans and the Socialist Party claiming Joan of Arc as a figure from the people, triumphing over the oppressive authority of the church. On the other extreme, you have Catholic monarchists who see her as enshrining the notion of a Catholic, most Christian kingship. in France.
After Joan's death, a cult in her memory had developed, and by the mid-19th century, calls were being made for her sainthood. Then her remains turned up, out of the blue.
A little pharmacist, maybe he makes a kind of false reliquary, and he presents this to the beatification process in Orléans, saying, look what I found in my home, look at that, these are the remains of Joan of Arc.
The church declared the remains might be real, and they were sent to Chinon for safekeeping. In 1920, almost 500 years after her death, Joan was canonized. Later, she became France's patron saint, a revered heroine. For Charlier, the motivation to make the forgery made sense, but to close the case file, he still had to crack the last part of the mystery. How had an Egyptian mummy ended up in a Parisian pharmacy attic?
Mummies have been used for therapeutic activities since the medieval ages.
In medieval medicine, parts of mummies were used to treat various ailments, particularly associated with bleeding. One example being treatment of hemorrhoids or piles.
Mummy medicine had lost its appeal before the 19th century, but it was said the building had been an apothecary for centuries. Could a mummy have been left in the attic since medieval times? Or had the body found its way there far more recently?
I think there is probably a very strong case for saying that these Egyptian relics arrived in France in the course of the 19th century as a result of the Napoleonic campaigns. The Napoleonic wars were productive of the looting and pillaging of all kinds of sites. Mummified corpses of Egyptians were, in fact, coming into France in quite considerable numbers. There are plenty of good reasons why mummified cats, given the status of the cat in Egyptian religion, should be found among these mummified collections. These are not medieval relics.
Charlier's quest was complete. He'd identified his patient, an ancient Egyptian. The team had carried out their analysis in secret, but 1 year on, it was time to let the cat and the mummy out of the bag.
At the end of the study, when the results were presented to the press and the media, it made a lot of sound in France, and all the people, the press and the journals were talking about it.
I was really expecting Dr. Charlier to find that these relics were genuine. We had TVs, we had magazines, we had interviews, etc., and suddenly it became yes, you know, an important information.
Charlier's extraordinary discovery made headline news, and the mummy remains were sent back to the fortress of Chinon for public display. The bones weren't Joan, but for Charlier and his team, it didn't matter.
We've seen from this study that you can get such detailed information from the smallest of fragments. I think showed how science can help unravel mysteries of the past.
Some people were disappointed by the result of this investigation. On the other hand, I think that the simple memory of her is probably enough.
Joan's memory will remain for a very long time. The qualities of human courage, fortitude, endurance, that is really what's made her reputation. She's an absolutely exceptional, remarkable figure. The relics are far, far less important than the life story.
It doesn't change anything to the person of Joan of Arc, which is unique, which is beautiful, which is exceptional. These are false relics. It doesn't change anything to the personage of Joan of Arc.
Charlier's investigation hadn't found Joan, but he had busted one of France's most intriguing myths. It's one of the most famous Greek myths. Legend told of the ultimate monster, a half-man, half-bull that fed on human flesh. The Minotaur was so dangerous, it was hidden in the depths of a maze it couldn't escape, the Labyrinth. But then came the ultimate hero, Theseus, who ventured into the heart of the lair and slayed the beast. For thousands of years, most believed it was just a story. But could the tale of the Labyrinth, Theseus, and the Minotaur be true?
There is a physical, historical reality upon which these Greek myths are based.
One English archaeologist was determined to prove the myth was fact.
He became obsessed with the idea of the bull and the labyrinth.
And in his search, discovered a lost civilization.
The boundaries between prehistoric and historic were no longer hard and fast.
This is the story of Arthur Evans and his quest to unearth the Minotaur's lair, the Labyrinth. Arthur Evans was born in 1851 and grew up in the industrial town of Nashmills, 25 miles north of London. His father, John Evans, was a rich paper mill owner. But his real passion for geology made him one of the most distinguished scholars of the age. Young Arthur showed no signs of inheriting his father's intelligence, and when his mother unexpectedly died, the boy retreated into a world of imagination. He was gripped by tales from ancient Greece, and his favorite hero was Theseus, the Minotaur slayer. The Minotaur was the monster son of Minos, the king of Crete. Minos had defeated the king of Athens in battle, whose forfeit was to feed the grisly beast with the flesh of boys and girls.
His body was a man's, but his head was the head of a bull, and his teeth were teeth of a lion, and with them he tore his prey.
Prince Theseus, the son of the king of Athens, was determined to end the contract, and by killing the Minotaur, win the love of his father. But Minos had hidden the beast in a labyrinth beneath his palace. People went in, but no one ever came out.
He went down winding paths, among the rocks, under caverns and arches, over heaps of falling stone.
At the heart of the lair, Theseus found the Minotaur. And charged at the beast.
And drove the keen sword through his throat.
The Minotaur was dead. Theseus escaped into the sunlight. Young Evans had no idea the story would lead him to make one of the greatest discoveries of the 20th century. But by the age of 24, he'd had enough of just reading about adventure. He wanted to live it himself, to make his own mark on history. His father, the great John Evans, had set the bar high with his discoveries of Stone Age Britain.
All sons of great men struggle, and they struggle under their father's shadow, and I don't think Evans is any exception to that.
Evans was referred to as Little Evans, so I think this may have been a bit difficult for him.
Evans was determined to find a way to prove himself.
He sees himself as kind of an adventurous character out of a novel almost, because he's heading off for adventure, and he knows that it's going to be quite dangerous.
So he set off for the most treacherous place he could think of. the Balkan states of Eastern Europe, ruled by the crumbling Ottoman Empire. But things didn't go quite to plan. Evans was arrested on suspicion of spying for Russia. He was released, but went on to be jailed again and was finally deported for encouraging rebellion. He'd had adventure, but despite it all, still hadn't found his real purpose. Back in England, Evans struggled to find a job until in 1884, family connections secured him a low-paid role in the backwaters of Oxford. He was now keeper of the Ashmolean Museum, in charge of a neglected collection of ramshackle antiquities. Action would be thin on the ground, but it was the ideal place to indulge his passion for ancient history, and, he hoped, find a subject to study that might enable him to match the achievements of his famous father. Evans's timing to make a name for himself couldn't have been better. Queen Victoria basked in the glow of a self-proclaimed golden age. Ruling over an empire that stretched so far around the globe, it was said the sun never set on her domains. Britain saw itself as the intellectual capital of the world, inventing the steam engine, the telephone, and the first light bulb. Engineers like Isambard Kingdom Brunel were pushing the boundaries, with architectural feats like Paddington Station, the world's first underground railway, and the largest ship ever built, the Great Eastern. Scientists around the world were making headline news. Chemists were filling the periodic table with new elements at a rate of almost one a year. Darwin was questioning the origins of man. Whilst pioneers in the emerging field of archaeology focused on the question of where this impressive Western civilization had come from.
This is a moment when European countries, feel very powerful, and intellectuals turn toward historical questions with a kind of confidence or desire to organize the past. People want to systematically explore what's underneath the ground.
At the time, most people believed classical Greece was the birthplace of Western civilization. Around 500 BC, the Greeks had invented an advanced culture. They'd influenced every European civilization since. The evidence was everywhere. Buildings, statues, art, literature, mathematics, science, as well as big ideas about the universe, democracy, crime and punishment. Some people doubted these had existed in Europe before the Greeks. Until archaeology began to overturn traditional beliefs. Evans had been captivated by news of Heinrich Schliemann, a German archaeologist who'd gone in search for the legendary city of Troy and found it in a Turkish hillside. Everyone thought it was a myth.
He notifies the world, this is it, I've discovered Troy.
The ancient Greek storyteller Homer had made the old folktale famous, telling of Paris of Troy, who eloped with Helen, the Queen of Sparta, sparking a bloody war between the Trojans and the Greeks.
And this is really the first moment when anybody starts to believe that these myths that survive from the classical period aren't just myths, but are based somehow in history.
That myth might be real created a press sensation. But Schliemann didn't stop there. He went on to the fortress at Mycenae in mainland Greece, where he claimed to discover the gold-rich tomb of its legendary king, Agamemnon, who'd led the Greek armies into the Trojan War.
Within the city walls, these very, very rich burials, one of which has this gold mask. And he said, "I've gazed upon the face of Agamemnon."
Mycenae was at least 1,000 years older than the classical Greek period. Were the origins of European civilization more ancient than previously believed?
He confirms that there is a physical historical reality upon which these Greek myths are based, and that is extraordinary.
Evans wasn't convinced Schliemann's discoveries were enough to rewrite the history books. So in 1883, he went to see the famous treasures for himself. But Evans quickly saw Schliemann was onto something. The treasures were clearly made with extraordinary skill. Coupled with impressive architecture and art, this was evidence of an ancient high culture.
You can see he's starting to realize, wow, wouldn't it be great to find a pre-Greek civilization that was the foundation of the classical era?
But Evans knew Schliemann was missing something vital, something all sophisticated societies had: writing.
Schliemann was looking for Mycenae rich in gold. He found the gold. Schliemann wasn't looking for script.
History was defined by what had been written down in the past. Anything that had happened before writing existed was just folklore. If the stories of ancient battles and mythical kings had been real, the people alive at the time must have had writing to record it. They'd have needed text to build palaces and fortresses, to make impressive jewelry. Amongst the rubble of Troy and Mycenae, there had to have been a script. Without it, there was no historical proof the Mycenaeans were the founders of European civilization, instead of the classical Greeks.
A couple buildings, a tomb, that's nice. Without a language, what do you have? Not a whole lot.
Evans saw his opportunity. If he could find a pre-Greek script, he would rewrite European history in a stroke. And he would no longer be little Evans. He would secure his place alongside his distinguished father.
Schliemann is getting all the headlines. His father had gotten all the headlines. I think Evans wanted to get his own headlines.
And so began Evans's quest to find the origins of Europe's high culture. It was a journey that would draw him into his favorite childhood story. If the Trojans, the Mycenaeans, and King Agamemnon had been real, was the Minotaur legend based on fact too?
All these characters are real. Is Theseus real? Is the Minotaur then real? Perhaps there was Labyrinth.
1888, Oxford, England. Back at the Ashmolean Museum, Evans's theory remained just that. With no evidence of a pre-Greek script, he'd reached a dead end. Until his first clue unexpectedly landed on his desk. A priest, the Reverend Greville Chester, had donated his collection of ancient seal stones. He'd bought them in bazaars across Greece and the Middle East. Evans was told some of the stones may be from the area around Mycenae, and some had come from the island of Crete, the home of the Minotaur myth.
When Evans first gets his hands on them, he knows that there's a direct link through to what Schliemann's been finding on the Greek mainland.
They were small semi-precious stones, red and green jasper, amethyst, and cornelian, used to sign for goods or documents by stamping their imprint into clay or wax, like a signature. But as he examined them, Evans saw they were inscribed with minute images and symbols he had never seen before. Until now, these stones had just been collected as curios by wealthy tourists on their travels. But Evans wondered if the images could be the ancient writing he was looking for.
And one in particular clearly fascinates Evans. It is a prismatic stone. That is to say, each side has a different carving on it, and so a different sort of image is made by impressing each side. Evans spends a lot of time looking at this, and this is, I think, one of the pieces of evidence that builds the argument in Evans's mind that there is a language to translate.
The stones were an intriguing clue that writing may have existed before the classical Greeks. But Evans knew he'd need a lot more stones if he was going to identify a complete script. And he needed to prove, if it was a text, it was older than the Greek alphabet. His next breakthrough came on a trip to Rome, where he met a pioneering field archaeologist, Federico Halbert. He was an expert on the island of Crete. He told Evans that Cretan farmers regularly dug up ancient seal stones. All were inscribed with mysterious imagery and were worn by locals as necklaces. And he told Evans something else. The prime spot to find the stones was a place called Knossos. The site was rumored to hide the lost palace of the mythical king Minos, who'd built a labyrinth to contain the raging Minotaur. Evans was intrigued. It was dawning on him that the origin of the earliest European writing could be entwined with the Minotaur myth. And both mysteries might unravel at Knossos in Crete. But before he could even think about a dig, he wanted to decode the seal stone's secrets. And to prove the symbols were from a pre-Greek civilization, he needed more of them. A trip to Athens had paid dividends. He'd found stones just like the museum's gems in a flea market near the Acropolis. The merchants insisted they'd come from Crete. Evans was puzzled by the symbols. He could see pictograms of animals and people, as well as more abstract symbols that appeared in groups. All like Egyptian hieroglyphs, but quite unique. He had no way of telling which way they were read or what they said. But was he looking at a pre-Greek language?
He knows that they have something to say. They're going to tell a big story, and he wants to be the person to tell that story.
Evans had to take his research one step further, and that meant going to the source of the seal stones, Crete.
Evans was well versed in the ancient writings about Crete as he sails down to Crete for the first time. He must have been very, very excited. And as you come in from the west, he could actually see this landscape that he'd heard about from the ancient authors.
After 6 years studying the seal stones, Evans climbed the hill at Knossos in search for the remains of the legendary palace of King Minos, the home of the dreaded Minotaur.
You know, it's in the middle of an olive field. Things do grow over. It sort of looks like an abandoned archaeological site.
He jumps down into one of the trenches. These were very deep trenches. Down in the bottom, he finds the walls.
Evans made an instant discovery. He recognized symbols carved into the stone wall, the marks of an ancient world.
He sees engraved markings, in some cases identical to the hieroglyphic script that he's been looking at, working on, collecting, trying to figure out. This makes Evans realize here is direct evidence of the script.
A wall was engraved with symbols Evans had seen on some of the seal stones. There was now no doubt in his mind. Surely he was on the trail of the earliest writing in Europe. Then he made another discovery, which fired his imagination even more.
It all becomes very real for him because he sees what we call the double axe.
The double-headed axe was called a labyrinth, an ancient weapon, and some believed the sacred symbol of an early incarnation of the Greeks' greatest god, Zeus. Myth told of Minos and Zeus's alliance. Evans was convinced the mark proved the building had been Minos's palace. He believed the word labyrinth was very similar to the Greek labyrinth. Was there a connection? Was this the first stage in uncovering the truth about the Minotaur legend? Evans, a man of science, found himself becoming bewitched not just by the quest to find the origins of European civilization, but the desire to find out the truth behind the myth. To dig up Knossos' secrets, Evans had to get permanent access to the site. He realized he had to own the land.
As Evans stood on the hill at Knossos, he realized that if he was going to beat out all the other suitors, he had to own it. As he'd done with the seal stones, he had to own the artifact of the site itself. So he set about instantly trying to acquire it.
Evans left a local agent to land the deal and returned to Oxford to make an announcement. During Evans's travels around Crete, he'd bought a considerable number of seal stones. With more symbols to analyze, he'd managed to identify more than 80 different characters. And he suspected he'd found not one, but 2 variations of an early script.
He presents a paper basically saying that this is the earliest script in Europe. And so it's a huge, huge coup.
Evans had identified pictograms on some seal stones, images to signify animals and objects. But other stones had abstract symbols engraved in a line, a linear text. Evans wondered if this was the emergence of an alphabet.
For European scholars in 1894, the idea that there was this really, really early script that the Mycenaeans are using is a major breakthrough because this is part of their definition for civilization. If you're civilized, you write history.
It's huge because it's a publication that argues that there's an undiscovered language that he's brought to the surface. What it does is it stakes Evans's claim as a big player in that field.
Evans had a tantalizing glimpse of ancient writing that might predate classical Greece by thousands of years. He wondered if a Mycenaean civilization on Crete was the true cradle of Western Europe. But to prove it, he needed more evidence of writing than just seal stones. If this ancient society was advanced, it had to have had vast amounts of writing. There had to be literature, a script to govern an empire on a material that could survive millennia, like clay tablets. Evans waited for news on his land sale. War was now brewing over Crete's independence from the Ottoman Empire. But he was undeterred. On the 6th of May, 1896, he paid out £235 for a quarter share of Knossos, equivalent to £22,000 in today's money. By law, he could now force the other owners to sell their shares and become the outright owner of the site.
There is a great sense of luck about Evans being there at the right time and having the money to buy the land at the right moment. And I think time and chance was everything as far as Evans was concerned.
Nobody else can come in and take the prize away from him. And so this is a huge moment for Evans. This is going to be his big discovery. This is what's going to turn him into Schliemann.
The Cretan conflict forced Evans to suspend his plans for 2 years. But by September 1898, the war was finally over. With the Ottomans expelled from the island, now at last, Evans could dig. But full access to Knossos wasn't going to be cheap. Buying just a quarter of the land had cleaned Evans out. To buy the rest and fund a dig, he wanted to raise a staggering £5,000, worth more than £500,000 today.
So Evans ends up being supported once again by his father, but his father gladly supports him. Evans may have been ambivalent about this, but he certainly accepts the aid.
With his money troubles solved, Evans went on a spending spree. London's Regent Street and Piccadilly Circus were the shopping destination for the well-heeled explorer. Here, gentlemen could buy guns, specialist canned foods, and the latest exploration clothing. And Evans wasn't going to economize. His shopping list totaled £56 and 1 shilling, the same as a worker's annual salary.
And so he's criticized for, having lavish tastes. He has champagne, he brings all his food out, hampers of all kinds of goodies.
(1900), Crete. After a long voyage by ship, Evans stepped ashore. He was now the outright owner of the site. But after 16 years as a museum curator, he was completely out of his depth.
Evans knows that he doesn't really have the digging expertise required to handle such a huge project. He may have felt a bit daunted by the whole thing. He needed somebody with experience.
Evans needed someone who spoke the local languages, could manage a vast number of workers, and document any finds. He knew the right man for the job.
So Evans sent a telegram to Duncan Mackenzie, and Mackenzie replied, yes, on the next boat, as it were. It was all very, very last minute.
And the contrast between the two men couldn't have been greater.
Duncan Mackenzie shows up, and of course he's the exact opposite to Evans. Evans is a diminutive, brunette, aristocrat. Duncan Mackenzie is a tall, red-headed Scot who loves drinking with the locals.
Unlike Evans, Mackenzie was an expert in the field. He'd spent years working as an archaeologist in Greece and spoke the language fluently. And unlike Evans, who had a degree in modern history, Mackenzie had studied philosophy and archaeology at university. Mackenzie hired diggers and the group set off for Knossos. It was a moment Evans had imagined for 6 years. By 11 a.m., the men had erected a tent headquarters, borrowed from the British Army, and run the Union flag up a pole in case anyone was in doubt who was in charge. Before noon, shovels of dirt were thrown from the hill. The first full-scale excavation of the palace of King Minos had begun. First off, Evans searched for the outline of the building, starting with the walls found decades before.
Evans was probably filled with apprehension. He spent so much money, of his father's money. What if there's nothing there to find? What if he's completely wrong?
But as soon as Evans dug virgin ground in his second week, he hit the jackpot.
At the highest point of the site, there was a clay tub filled with inscribed tablets. This is something that nobody had ever found before in Greece or in Europe.
Evans discovered hundreds of clay tablets, many in pieces, inscribed with writing, a similar text to the seal stones, but far more advanced. Evans called it Linear B.
It's on a clay tablet, so it's not inscribed in stone. This indicates that there is a sort of a everyday use of language. He recognizes some symbols, but not all of them. He realizes that it's even more complex than he thought, which is, of course, thrilling to him.
And critically, a discovery of pottery meant Evans could date the clay tablets.
On the same day, they find a stirrup jar. A stirrup jar is a very specific kind of a pot that Schliemann had found many of at Mycenae. So it absolutely unequivocally connects the culture that Evans is digging at Knossos with what Schliemann has found at Mycenae.
The pottery was the same style as the Mycenaean finds on the mainland and dated to roughly 1400 BC. Linear B was at least 900 years older than the writing of classical Greece. For Evans, this was proof the Mycenaeans on Crete had invented Europe's high culture, not the more recent classical Greeks.
He's so delighted that he sends a telegram to the Times, but also to his father, and his father replies by sending him a huge sum of money to find more tablets.
The Times newspaper made the discovery public. And Evans's father was so proud, he wired a staggering £500 to his son to upscale the dig. But however grateful, Evans was anxious his famous father's support might cast a shadow on his rare moment in the spotlight.
Arthur Evans writes back to his father and says, thanks, and this is very good. He said, however, this is my excavation, and I have done this. This is my find. It's good to keep this in the family, but let's remember that this is mine. This was something that could not at all in any manner be connected with his father's accomplishment or status, but it was something he had made by himself.
John Evans's money was put to good use, and more tablets emerged from deeper in the ground. But Evans saw the writing on these clay tablets was different from Linear B. It seemed simpler and even older. He called it Linear A. Was this the missing link in the story of the script? Did Linear A bridge the gap between the symbols on the seal stones and the Linear B text? Evans was sure he'd discovered 3 stages of writing, developed by Europe's most ancient civilized society. It was an extraordinary feat and a personal breakthrough. Finally, he'd matched his father's achievements. He was now his own man.
He's making the sort of discovery that allows him to rise up shoulder to shoulder with his father.
But Evans was determined to go further. He wanted to reveal the root of the myth, too. He wanted to find the Labyrinth and the Minotaur. 3 weeks in, the diggers were excavating a room filled with rubble when they discovered a fragment of a wall painting, a bull's hoof.
And this, of course, for Evans is the Minotaur. This is where Theseus went in to fight. You have the tangible evidence that you're holding in your hands that links through to the mythological story.
It was Evans's first glimpse of what could be a Minotaur. But where was the mythical king? In the same room, Evans made an even more remarkable discovery. Embedded into the opposite wall was an imposing stone chair.
He says, I have found the first throne of Europe. Thrones of Europe are important things, and Evans has found the first one. It must have been an extraordinary confirmation of Evans for all the risks he had taken.
For Evans, its owner was beyond doubt.
It's become the throne of Minos. It's the labyrinth. Everything has to do with Minos. Minos and the Minotaur and Theseus.
But so far, no labyrinth. Evans kept digging. Finally, amongst the debris, cascading staircases, deep chambers, and long passages began to emerge.
So he's excavating through many small corridors and rooms. And this no doubt brings to mind this concept of the labyrinth, of course.
Evans, the man of science, believed he'd found King Minos' maze, but he wanted to find more evidence of the Minotaur. Then, on day 55 of the dig, the workers were dusting through the rubble when they shrieked out loud.
They find the relief head of a bull fresco where the bull is bellowing with the tongue hanging out, and they leap back and they're horrified because for them this is an image of the devil.
They'd found a 3-dimensional lime plaster fresco, a raging life-size bull, nostrils flaring, poised to charge.
Evans sees this as really a confirmation that this is the head of the Minotaur.
This is literally, in 3 dimensions, an illustration from the mythological past. It's bringing that mythological interpretation of the site closer to the archaeological remains.
So you have the labyrinth, and not only that, but you have the imagery of the raging bull there on the walls in more than one place. The public must have been completely blown over by this.
The myth of the Minotaur and the labyrinth had been based on something real, and he had found it. The convoluted building was the maze. The bull frescoes were the Minotaur. The throne belonged to the legendary Minos. He'd even found the image of the king in a fresco. Evans, once a man of science, had lost any reservations he may once have had about myth being true. It took Evans 31 years to expose the colossal building at Knossos. Covering an area of 22,000 square meters, it was the size of 3 football pitches. And it surrendered more artifacts than Evans could have imagined. Knossos was an engineering marvel, with a vast central courtyard, a grand staircase, and one of the oldest and best preserved ancient roads in Europe. A complex system of aqueducts, a sewage system, even the world's first flushing toilet. Evans had gone in search for the Mycenaeans, the oldest known advanced European civilization. But as his work on Crete progressed, he realized he'd found an even earlier society. He called the people of Knossos the Minoans. They were a highly sophisticated people who'd flourished from the 27th century BC, many hundreds of years before the Mycenaeans had existed. The writing of Crete had to be Minoan. In 1911, Evans was awarded a knighthood for services to archaeology. He was Little Evans no more, but the great Sir Arthur Evans. Over the years, Evans refined his theories. The idea of the Minotaur was great for generating newspaper headlines, but Evans had to admit it was more likely the Minoans had worshipped the bull as part of their religion. Maybe girls and boys had sailed from Athens not to be fed to the Minotaur, as myth said, but to jump bulls as a rite of passage. Could the building, with its countless rooms and corridors, have started the legend of a maze? Later archaeologists dismissed his model of the Great Palace of Knossos. Its design was a product of his imagination. He had ignored evidence suggesting a different story.
Evans discovered a new civilization. What he did with it was he turned it into the sort of civilization that he wanted, and he centered it around the Greek myths about Crete. He became obsessed with the idea of the bull and the labyrinth and what the mythology gave us.
Modern scholars don't believe Knossos was a palace, but a temple run by priestesses to worship gods and goddesses who ensured plentiful harvests. There had never been evidence of Minos. Evans had found several fragments from different frescoes and created his king. The occupant of the stone chair is still unknown. So why had Evans, who prided himself on being a man of science, fitted the facts into his own picture of the past? Had he subconsciously acted out the true meaning of the Minotaur legend?
The Minotaur for the ancient Greeks was something that you had to enter the maze and overcome. In a sense, it was a part of themselves.
Had Evans lost his objectivity because of his psychological need to supersede his father? Had he and his hero Theseus been driven by the same desire to win the admiration of their father?
Yes, I will make him love me, for I will prove myself worthy of his love.
Probably what the Theseus myth is telling us about is going into a dark place, confronting this wild and untamed part of yourself, and then bringing it down, basically.
Theseus had killed the beast, and Evans had slayed his demons. He'd found Minoan writing and what he believed was the origins of the Minotaur myth.
And he whispered, "It is done."
Evans made mistakes, but he was the first to recognize the importance of the seal stones, and his discovery of written clay tablets transformed our understanding of the origins of European civilization. After his death in 1941, Linear B, the advanced writing on the clay tablets, was finally translated. It was a sophisticated writing system with 187 characters. The tablets recorded the ownership of property by local people and their offerings to the Knossos temple. Evans had been convinced Linear B belonged to his great Minoans. But it was, in fact, Mycenaean. And astonishingly, it was the earliest form of the Greek language, at least 400 years older than the Greek alphabet. But why was the writing Mycenaean rather than Minoan? Today's scholars think they know what happened. The Minoans of Crete died out around 1450 BC. Then the mainland Mycenaeans arrived, and they discovered Minoan writing. The Minoans had been writing for centuries. Their script started as pictograms and hieroglyphs engraved on seal stones, and evolved into a more complex text written in lines, Linear A. To this day, the meaning of the hieroglyphs and Linear A is a mystery. But experts know the Minoans were writing 450 years before the Mycenaeans. 1350 years before the classical Greeks. Evans had been right all along. Western Europe's civilization didn't start with classical Greece. It didn't even start with the Mycenaeans. It all began with the even more ancient Bronze Age Minoans, and we only know about them because of Arthur Evans.
We now have a chance to look at this golden age and look at the art from this period and the wonderful architecture from this period and realize that this was a really spectacular time for humans.
Evans had discovered a long-lost civilization, and in finding Minoan and Mycenaean writing, had left his own mark on history.